China and its military have been all over the news recently. Should we be scared of their power, or is it all propaganda? We're going to discover that and more in this overlook of China's military. The Chinese military forces, known as the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, and its naval component, the PLAN, have always stressed numbers over quality. Beginning in 1949, the Chinese strategy of warfare, as articulated by their leader Mao Zedong, emphasized the superiority of man over weapons. Although weapons were certainly a significant component of winning any battle, Mao was quoted as saying, "They were not the decisive factor. It's people, not things, that are decisive." The contest of strength is not only a contest of military and economic power, but also a contest of human power and morale. To Mao, non-material factors like creativity, flexibility, and high morale were also critical determinants in warfare. Of course, he made those comments when China was still hobbled by an agrarian economy and long before they had the technology and resources to combat the United States and other Western powers on an equal material footing. In more recent times, China's made an effort to increase not just its overall numbers of advanced weapons, like tanks, missiles, ships, and aircraft, but to improve their quality as well. Nowhere is that effort for improvement more noticeable than in the People's Liberation Army Navy, or PLAN, which is undergoing a historic increase in shipbuilding and associated warfare capabilities. Rear Admiral Michael Studeman, commander of the Office of Naval Intelligence, was quoted in January 2023 as saying the PLAN is involved in a buildup in every warfare area, from its nascent Space Force and cyber warfare efforts to a fully capable blue water navy. "We'll see more of the Chinese Navy in the future," he said, as it operates farther from its home ports and its normal regional interests, specifically the South China Sea. China's expanding its logistics networks across the globe via port access agreements, formal basing arrangements, and takeovers of ports and nations that defaulted on infrastructure loans with China. But more importantly, the PLAN is increasing the size of its blue water fleet at a rapid pace. Here's what they have in service as of early 2023 with an outlook on what they're building for the future. Current strengths of the PLAN. The U.S. Defense Department is forecasting an increase in the PLAN from around 340 ships in 2023 to almost 500 by 2035. In 2021 alone, the PLAN launched a total of 21 ships, while the U.S. Navy commissioned just 7. The question is, does China have enough ships right now to confront the U.S. Navy and its allies in the Western Pacific and win, or would they be better off waiting a few years or even a decade in order to have a more overwhelming advantage? Let's take a look at what we know of current numbers of PLAN ships and assets. Aircraft carriers. 3. The pride of any modern navy and the ship around which most current fleets are built is the supercarrier. China's been a latecomer to this party, but they're making up for it in a big way. They're currently operating 3 carriers: the 1990s-era Type 001 Liaoning, relegated to mostly a training role, the Type 002 Shandong, and the recently launched Type 003 Fujian. The Type 001 and 002 are almost identical and both include a ski jump launch ramp, which is replaced on the Type 003 with an electromagnetic catapult launcher. Types 1 and 2 are both in the 60 to 70,000 ton range, while Type 3 is expected to displace between 85,000 and 90,000 tons. These carriers are equipped mostly with the J-15 Flying Shark naval fighter, which we'll discuss later. The Type 1 and 2 can carry between 40 and 45 fighter aircraft and helicopters, while the larger Type 3 is expected to have a complement of up to 60 total aircraft. In comparison, the U.S. Ford-class carrier, the U.S. Navy's most modern carrier, has a complement of up to 85 aircraft and displaces around 100,000 tons. In 2021, analysts reported that the Type 3 will operate the Shenyang J-15B variant, a modernized version of the J-15 that'll feature catapult launch capability, modern 5th-generation avionics, active electronically scanned array radar, new airframes, stealth coatings, and new engines with possible thrust vectoring capability. This aircraft is expected to be a stopgap aircraft until the scheduled PLAN stealth carrier fighter is developed and produced. More on that later as well. There's much discussion about a proposed 4th PLAN aircraft carrier currently under development and known only as the Type 04. Unfortunately, not many concrete details are known about this ship. Its debut will not be seen until 2024 at the earliest and possibly not till 2025. It's rumored to have an electromagnetic launch capability like the U.S. Navy Ford-class carriers and might be nuclear-powered as well, though again, nothing's been confirmed. It's interesting to note that the early models and paintings of the Type 004 bear an ID number of 20, while Type 003, just entering service, bears the ID number of 18. This suggests there might be another carrier in the planning stages, probably a sister ship to the Type 003, which could presumably bear the ID number 19. Landing helicopter docks. 3. One of the areas the Chinese government has addressed as a pressing issue is the PLAN's ability to land troops during an amphibious operation, such as the possible invasion of Taiwan. They have therefore placed a strong emphasis on modernizing and increasing the size of their amphibious assault forces. The largest of these vessels are currently the 3 Type 075 landing helicopter docks, or LHD, very large ships at between 30,000 and 40,000 tons. Their size allows them to operate almost as escort carriers, with a flight deck that allows for 7 takeoff and landing spots, with 2 elevators for moving helicopters from below deck. They can carry 3 Type 726 Yuyi-class LCAC hovercraft, which can be launched from a floatable well dock. The LHDs also carry up to 60 armored fighting vehicles and between 700 and 800 troops. These LHDs are modern ships built since 2018, with an estimated 8 more expected to be completed in the next 10 years. Their one limiting factor is that as of 2023, China does not operate a vertical takeoff and landing, or VTOL, aircraft like the US's F-35B, so the LHDs are limited to rotary aircraft only. Amphibious transport docks. 8. While the LHDs are expected to be the backbone of any future amphibious attack, the 8 Type 071 Amphibious Transport Docks, or ATDs, will no doubt be used as well. Smaller than the LHDs, but still impressive at 25,000 tons displacement, these ships don't have a flight deck, but they do have a stern landing deck for 2 Z-8 transport helicopters and room on board for up to 4 more. The ATDs also have a floatable well deck for up to 4 Type 726 hovercraft and can carry the same number of armored vehicles, up to 60, and more troops, up to 800, than the LHDs. The Type 71 can also carry landing craft on port and starboard davits. And while both the Type 75 and Type 71 ships have limited SAM launchers for self-defense, they'll need protection from other ships in any fleet action where an amphibious operation is expected to be opposed. Landing ship tanks. 36. Weighing in at around 4,000 tons, the PLAN also operates some 36 medium-sized landing ship tanks. Each of these can carry up to 250 troops and between 10 to 12 combat vehicles, which can be offloaded through their bow doors or via a stern ramp. Every modern carrier-based fleet needs protection from missiles and attacking aircraft. This role in modern fleets is served by the more modern multi-role missile-carrying destroyers. In the PLAN, there are generally 3 levels of capability for their destroyer fleet. Type 055, Renhai class ships. 8. The best of their destroyers are the 8 commissioned Type 055 Renhai class ships that displace about 13,000 tons. Very large for a destroyer and almost the size of a World War II heavy cruiser. In comparison, Germany's World War II heavy cruiser, the Admiral Hipper, was only slightly larger at 14,000 tons displacement. The Type 55 is inherently stealthy and boasts a massive complement of 112 vertical launch systems, or VLS, that can handle HHQ-9 surface-to-air missiles with a range of between 120 and 250 kilometers, YJ-18 anti-ship missiles with a range of 220 to 540 kilometers, YJ-21 anti-ship missiles, a reported 1,500-kilometer range, CJ-10 land attack missiles over 1,500 kilometers of range, and various missile-launched anti-submarine torpedoes. These destroyers are some of the best in the world, and their striking power is unmatched by any other ship of its size. The Zumwalt-class destroyers, while even larger than the Type 55s, displacing 15,900 tons, only carry 80 VLRS tubes. Another 12 to 15 Type 55s are in various stages of planning or building, with 1 or 2 new ships expected to be launched each of the next 5 or 6 years. It's noteworthy that the PLAN was able to launch all 8 of their current Type 55s in only 3 years, from 2017 to 2020. As an aside, the U.S. classifies these ships as cruisers, which are defined by the U.S. Navy as large multi-mission surface combatants with flag facilities. This suggests the U.S. expects the Type 55 to fulfill a similar role as the Ticonderoga-class cruiser. Type 052D, Luoyang 3 class, 26. Almost as capable are the smaller 26 vessels of the Type 52D Luoyang 3 class. With its 7,500-ton displacement, it is a larger variant of the Type 52C. The Type 52D was China's first dedicated multi-role destroyer, as it oversaw the switch from swing-arm launchers to the vertical launch tube array. The Type 52D has a more modest 64 tubes. The Type 52D also employs the same flat-paneled active electronically scanned array radar that the Type 55 uses. Unlike the Type 55s, though, their missile complement includes the earlier version of the HHQ-9 air defense missile with a shorter 120-kilometer range, the earlier YJ-18 anti-ship missile with a 220-kilometer range, and the CY-5 anti-submarine missiles. Despite being based on earlier designs and smaller than the Type 55s, these ships are still quite modern and more capable of handling air and missile defense over quite a large area. Another 6 are being built, though from that point on it's expected that the Type 55 will do the heavy lifting when it comes to air defense for the PLAN. Type 052C Luoyang 2 class. 6. The second level of battle-worthy destroyers would include the 6 Type 052C Luoyang 2 class destroyers, launched in 2004 and 2006, and the 2 Type 51C Luzhou class ships launched beginning in 2006. The Type 52C, displacing 7,000 tons, was the first PLAN vessel that included both a fixed active electronically scanned array radar as well as vertically launched surface-to-air missiles, making it the first Chinese warship with area-wide air defense capability. Its launch system includes a standard complement of 48 HHQ-9 surface-to-air missiles with a range of 120 kilometers that are cold-launched from 8 revolver-type vertical launchers with 6 missiles per launcher, along with 8 tube-launched YJ-62 anti-ship cruise missiles with a range of 280 kilometers. Because of this earlier launch system, these ships could be overwhelmed by a mass attack of modern hypersonic or sea-skimming missiles. No additional Type 55C or 51C destroyers are currently being built. Type 51C Luzhou class. 2. The 2 Type 51C destroyers at 7,100 tons lack the stealthier radar cross-section found on the newer Chinese warships and possess a less advanced steam turbine propulsion compared to the gas turbine propulsion present in all newer Chinese destroyers. The Type 51C was considered a temporary answer for a long-range area air defense platform that blended the proven hull design of the Type 51 with the existing SAM systems that were deemed capable for fleet defense. Production of this class ended once the more advanced Type 52C destroyers became available. Type 52B Luoyang 1 class. 2. Russian-built Submarine class. 4. Type 51B Luhai class. 1. Type 52 Luhu class. 2. The least battle-worthy of the PLAN destroyers includes the last remaining commissioned vessels in several classes: 2 Type 52B Luoyang 1 class, 4 Russian-built Submarine class, 1 Type 51B Luhai class, and 2 Type 52 Luhu class. These are expected to either be relegated to China's equivalent of the Coast Guard or mothballed as more of the larger Type 55s come online. Frigates. 47. Frigates are considered escort vessels that are smaller than the current PLAN destroyer class of ships. These include several varieties: the 32 Type 54A Zhengkai 2 class at 3,960 tons displacement, the 2 Type 54 Zhengkai 1 vessels, 3,900 tons displacement, the 10 Type 53H3 Zhengwai 2 2,200 tons displacement, and the 3 Type 53 Zhenghu class 2,000 tons displacement. Type 54A Zhengkai 2 class. 32. Of these, the Type 54As are the most lethal, with a 32-cell VLS system armed with HQ-16 missiles with a 40-kilometer range. While not armed with the longer-range SAMs that larger ships have, they can supplement the overall air defense system, while also being useful submarine hunters with their Type 87 anti-submarine rocket launcher with 36 rockets carried, and its 3 U-8 ASW torpedo launchers. Their SAM missiles, however, are really only useful for self-defense, not as part of an area air defense system, and their sonars are relatively short-ranged. There are current plans to build as many as 30 more of these relatively inexpensive Type 54s, though, through 2035. Type 54 Zhengkai 1 class. 2. The Type 54 Zhengkai 1 class was designed in the 1990s and built into 2005. Though older, they do include features like stealthy hull designs and the YJ-83 sea-skimming anti-ship missiles with a 180-kilometer range, though they're launched in an 8-cell launcher with 16 additional missiles stored in their automatic loaders. Type 53H3 Zhengwai 2. 10. The Type 53 Zhenghu class. 3. The Type 53 Zhenghu class were also armed with the YJ-83 missile in 2 4-cell launchers, along with the HQ-61 surface-to-air missiles with an 18-kilometer range. These and the Type 54 have already seen many of their sister ships transferred to China's Coast Guard or sold overseas, and these will likely accompany them in due time. Corvettes. 72. The smallest of the PLAN's intended blue ocean fleet are the corvettes. Type 56A. 50. 50 of these are the Type 56A guided missile corvettes with 1,500 tons displacement, which began production in 2013 and are of a relatively new design and are equipped with both an active sonar and a towed array sonar, which is uncommon for ships this small. They incorporate modest stealth superstructures and are armed with 4 YJ-83 anti-ship missiles and 2 triple-tube 324mm torpedo launchers, which might carry U-7 light ASWs. Type 56 class. 22. The Type 56A class are supported by 22 earlier Type 56 class corvettes. These ships are less useful to the Blue Water Fleet due to more limited fuel and ammunition supplies, but they are equipped with both a hull-mounted sonar and a single ASW helicopter. Both types are expected to stay mostly close to shore and provide coastal and port security and defense, and might also wind up in the Chinese Coast Guard along with the aforementioned frigates. Missile boats 106. The smallest ships of the PLAN that'll still pack an offensive punch are the missile boats, small and fast, though not very survivable in dedicated shooting wars. They're expected to operate much like the famous PT boats of World War II. Get in, fire their armament, and then get away even faster. Type 22, 82. Though small in size at 224 tons, the 82 Type 22 fast missile boats are an ingenious solution that the PLAN began to deploy in 2004. These craft are designed to patrol China's coastal areas and operate within its littoral zone. However, as each of the Type 22s is armed with 8 YJ-83 anti-ship missiles, it's speculated by some observers that a large number of the craft firing in salvos could potentially overwhelm an enemy fleet, including an aircraft carrier battle group. The design is based on an Australian catamaran craft that provides a more stable launch platform than other ships of its size, especially in the high seas. All 82 of these ships were launched between 2004 and 2011, though no additional ships of this class are pending. Type 37-2, 6. The PLAN also operates 6 Type 37-2 corvettes, weighing in at about 420 tons. These anti-submarine shallow water patrol craft were built between 1964 and 1982, so they're far from state-of-the-art. As newer models of corvettes have entered service, these ships have been phased out or put into storage. Type 37IG, 18. That's much of the same fate as the 18 Type 37 IG corvettes, built between 91 and 1999. The IG is an anti-ship version of the Type 37 and are equipped with a small complement of 4 C-801, 802, 803 anti-ship missiles, effectively the same missile as the YJ-83, with a range of about 120 kilometers. Rounding out their surface fleet, the PLAN also have 26 smaller sub-chasers and 36 minesweepers. These won't be part of any nominal blue water fleet unless they're transitioning to protect some other more distant coastal or port areas. Type 94 Jin-class ballistic missile submarines, 7. The exact number of active submarines in the PLAN is a state secret, so the numbers listed here are best estimates by various analysts and Western sources. The most dangerous are the PLAN 7 Jin-class ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs. These boats were considered by the US DoD as China's first credible seaborne nuclear deterrent. Their weapon systems originally carried 12 single-warhead JL-2 SLBMs with a 7,200-kilometer range. These have mostly been replaced by the JL-3 SLBMs with a range of over 10,000 kilometers, which gives the Jin the ability to reach the continental US. The PLAN has boasted through numerous improvements that the boats are now currently as quiet as the US's improved Los Angeles class. But in 2009, the US Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence reported that the Shangs were about as noisy as the Russian Victor III class submarine, which entered service in 1979. 6 of these have been built, and another 2 upgraded models are still being built. The Type 94 succeeded the Type 92's SSBNs and will in turn be replaced by the Type 96 sub, which is under development and expected to come online starting in the mid-2020s. Type 93 Shang-class nuclear-powered attack submarines, 6. The PLAN also operates 6 Shang-class nuclear-powered attack submarines. As with the Type 94, the PLAN believes they're as quiet as some of the best US Navy attack ships, though ONI reports they're about as noisy as late 70s Russian-era ships. This will hinder them in attacking US assets, which might not be as much of a problem when encountering ships from India and maybe Japan. They're armed with 6 torpedo tubes and can launch a range of weapons, including the U-3, the first indigenous Chinese torpedo with a range of 13.3 kilometers, the U-4 with a 15-kilometer range, and the U-6 torpedoes with a 46-kilometer range, as well as the YJ-82 anti-ship cruise missiles with less than a 42-kilometer range. Type 39A, also called the Type 41 Yuan class, 17. China possesses 17 Yuan-class diesel-electric attack subs, SSKs. These are the plan's first air-independent propulsion or AIP-powered subs, making them some of the quietest diesel-electric subs in any Navy. While at first considered by the US Navy as an anti-ship cruise missile platform capable of remaining submerged for lengthy periods of time in difficult-to-acquire coastal areas, it's since been expected to take on the role of a traditional blue water attack submarine. Kilo class, 10. China originally purchased 12 Russian-origin Kilo-class submarines, 2 Project 877 vessels, 2 Project 636 vessels, and 8 Project 636M vessels. In late 2021, the PLAN retired the 2 Project 877 vessels, leaving 10 Russian-origin Kilo-class subs in service. Type 39 Song-class, 13. China possesses 13 Song-class diesel-electric attack submarines. Not as quiet nor as fast as their upgraded Type 39A or Type 41 cousins, these are considered more coastal protection and less useful for long-term employments. Type 35 Ming-class, 22. China possesses 22 Ming-class diesel-electric attack submarines. While the early models, Type 35s, were deemed acceptable when they were first designed in the early 1980s, over the decades since their inception, many improvements were deemed necessary. Many variants have been developed since then, such as the Type 35A with 6 built, the Type 35G with 12 built, and the Type 35B with 4 built. All Ming-class submarines possess 533mm torpedo tubes, and Type 35Bs are capable of firing cruise missiles from their torpedo tubes. Not if the PLAN will attack, but when? President Xi has already stated he wants the Chinese military to be prepared to retake Taiwan by force no later than 2027, which just so happens to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Liberation Army. By that time, it'll have added hundreds of new missiles, a dozen more advanced destroyers, and a couple more nuclear attack subs, and might even have come close to addressing its carrier aviation woes. She's also called for the military to achieve world-class status by 2049, suggesting the ability to dominate the Western Pacific despite any efforts by the U.S. Navy and its allies Japan, Australia, and possibly India. It's clear China's already preparing for an invasion of Taiwan, as its most recent exercise in April 2023, codenamed Joint Sword, demonstrated. The 3-day event included 80 fixed-wing and 40 rotary craft helicopter sorties from the Type 2 Shandong carrier, as well as simulated attack drills using aircraft armed with live weapons. The exercise was a coordinated effort designed for a large-scale attack on Taiwan. Though the effort was somewhat limited in scope, the PLAN only deployed 1 carrier, the Shandong, 11 other warships, and 91 aircraft, with the majority of the aircraft being land-based types. These included Su-30 fighters and H-6 bombers, as well as carrier-based J-11s and J-15s. Official Chinese outlets admitted the aircraft involved carried live ammunition and practiced multiple waves of simulated strikes on important targets, both on the island of Taiwan as well as supposed naval threats. Following the conclusion of the 3-day operation, the PLA's Eastern Theater Command said in a statement, "The troops in the theater are ready to fight all the time and can fight at any time, resolutely crushing any form of Taiwan independence, separatism, and foreign interference." While this is not the largest naval exercise that the PLAN has carried out, those that followed the Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August 2022 included 13 warships and 68 planes, as well as live-fire ballistic missile launches. It's the first where the PLAN simulated a blockade of the entire island, and the first that involved one of its 2 frontline carriers. Taiwan's radar showed 4 J-15 fighter jets to the island's east, demonstrating that the PLAN is for the first time simulating attacking from the east, rather than only from the west where China's mainland lies. All its previous military exercises involved only a show of force in the western Strait of Taiwan. Analysts also said it was likely the J-15 fighters had come from the Shandong aircraft carrier, one of the 2 frontline carriers China is currently operating, while their 3rd carrier, the recently launched Type 003, named the Fujian, undergoes sea trials. During the operation, the Shandong was deployed in the western Pacific Ocean, roughly 200 miles southeast of Taiwan. It should be noted that through the years, other countries have launched invasions under the guise of exercises and drills, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's very likely any real invasion of Taiwan may begin using the same ruse. One element suggesting a sooner rather than later war might be the drawdown of U.S. and other Western countries' stockpiles of missiles, ammunition, and artillery, which has resulted from them supplying these resources to Ukraine. Estimates are that Ukraine is burning through an estimated 6,000 artillery shells per day. The stockpiles the West and the U.S. have relied on to keep Ukraine supplied can't be replaced as quickly as they're being expended. The return of stockpiles to pre-invasion levels could take years to accomplish. A recent war simulation between the U.S. and China over the island of Taiwan, run by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, concluded the U.S. could run out of some munitions in as little as a week. Current efforts are being made to strengthen supply chains and make it easier for private U.S. companies to ramp up production in the event of a war, but these changes could also take years to implement. These problems are particularly concerning since the rate at which China has been acquiring high-end weapon systems and equipment is 5 to 6 times faster than the US, according to some US government estimates. Overall, the Pentagon hopes to increase artillery ammunition production 5-fold in the next 2 years, the largest production increase since the mid-1950s and the Korean War. This would include both rockets and conventional shells, and it'd be understandable if China also had reached the same conclusion and decides to take on the US armed forces before they address these shortcomings and adapt overall production infrastructure to correct the shortfalls. The US has made it clear that its military is anticipating and prepping for a future conflict centered around defeating or at least containing Chinese military aggression. Not only is the US working to increase the number of bases it has access to in the Western Pacific, it's also begun to change its force structure to better fit the amphibious warfare expected in such a scenario. For example, the US Marine Corps is undergoing a once-in-a-generation restructuring of their forces, ditching heavy equipment like tanks in favor of more mobile strike forces that can be deployed from littoral combat ships and helicopter assets. China is undoubtedly aware of this and has to gauge whether they should strike before the US fully implements this changeover in planning, logistics, and tactics dubbed Force Design 2030. Then there are the estimates that China's population is shrinking, an unsettling proposition that the country has tried to conceal. For the first time since the famines of Mao's Great Leap Forward in 1961, China's population dropped in 2022, losing an officially estimated 850,000 people from its count, though the actual number might be even higher than the Chinese government is willing to admit. Not only is China's population dropping, but their population pyramid is upside down. China is failing to replace its aging population with sufficient numbers of younger men and women that are needed both in working roles as well as the military. The longer China waits, the smaller its manpower pool from which it draws on prospective soldiers, sailors, and pilots will be. Besides the focus on Taiwan, there are other flashpoints across the Western Pacific, such as the areas of the South China Sea, that China, through building bases on atolls and reefs, claims as their sovereign territory. While their right to own such areas has been denied by the United Nations, China holds firm to their perceived right and continues to engage in heated exchanges whenever the US or another regional power attempts to sail through such areas. The most recent near altercation came in April 2023, when the Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer USS Milius performed a freedom of navigation operation, FONOP, in the South China Sea near the Spratly Islands area called Mischief Reef, an aptly named site for an accidental launch of a world war if there ever was one. Events like Taiwan invasion exercises and the ongoing incidents over the contested portions of the South China Sea support the concern that an unplanned incident could launch an unexpected conflict at any moment. Some Chinese leaders might believe they'd be better off striking sooner than later, even if the alternative would mean the PLAN would be larger and more robust just a few years from now. But that last point might be the most compelling reason why China might just wait before it launches an overt attack. Why would they wait? Many elements of the PLAN's modernization won't come online until 5 to 10 years from now, including its most advanced aircraft carrier, the Type 004, which remains a mystery for the most part. It's not clear what stage of development it's in. It's not even clear whether it'll make use of advanced nuclear propulsion systems like the 11 current US carriers. According to many observers, China's naval nuclear reactor technology is not advanced enough to support a warship the size of the Type 004. This matters a great deal because nuclear propulsion will allow the ship to sail farther without refueling, only needing to be resupplied with provisions for the crew as well as ammunition and other expendables for its combat assets. A nuclear propulsion unit would also provide more energy to run the advanced electromagnetic launch systems and advanced Aegis-type radar and other sensor suites, as well as future weapon add-ons like railguns and directed energy weapons. It should be noted that the USS Gerald Ford is designed around not just one but two powerful nuclear propulsion systems, as will all future Ford-class supercarriers. This provides an excess of power for future improvements during an anticipated 50-year lifespan for the Ford-class carriers, and allows for several refits and upgrades. Some observers have noted that the current ID number attached to the Type 004 is 20, while the Type 003 is 18. That gap has led to speculation that China is planning a second Type 003 carrier, a sister ship to the Shandong, which could carry the ID-19 and which would be cheaper and quicker to build than the groundbreaking Type 4. This has led to estimates that the PLAN could field 5 modern aircraft carriers by 2030, including the Type 004 and the Type 003 sister ship, as well as a total of 10 ballistic missile subs, an increase over its current 6. But by 2030, the U.S. should have an additional 2 Ford-class carriers as well, each of which are larger than the planned Type 004 carrier at 80,000 tons versus the Ford-class carrier's 100,000 tons. The Ford-class carriers will also field up to 85 aircraft, while the Type 004s will possibly carry 45 to 60 aircraft. Another area where the PLAN lags behind the U.S. is in trained carrier pilots. It's no secret the Chinese Navy has had trouble fielding an adequate carrier aircraft trainer. Its current option, the JL-9G, a single-engine twin-seat aircraft first deployed in 2011, is based on a design that's too weak to take the continued pounding that carrier landings place on an aircraft's body, so it's been limited to only simulated carrier landings and takeoffs on ground-based mock-ups. And as any carrier pilot will tell you, the most difficult part of being a carrier-based pilot is trying to land on an airplane on a short diagonal runway of a ship that's moving away from you, often at night and sometimes in rough seas. Ground-based mock-ups would not sufficiently be an accurate simulation for the intensity and difficulty of a true carrier landing. There are concurrent problems with its standard carrier fighter, the J-15 Flying Shark, which was mocked by Russia as a poorly back-engineered version of a 2001 Su-33 prototype, the T-10K3, which they had bought from Ukraine. At a reported 17.5 tons, the J-15 is now thought to be the world's heaviest carrier-borne fighter. In comparison, the U.S. Navy's F/A-18 weighs only 14.5 tons, and the F-35C Lightning II is only slightly more at 14.6 tons. The J-15 suffers from either having to carry less than optimal fuel, giving it less range, or less armament, giving it less lethality, if it intends to take off from the two Type 1 and Type 2 ski-jump-equipped carriers. With a pair of Chinese-designed engines that fail to produce adequate thrust-to-weight ratios, its underwhelming performance has earned it the nickname of the flopping fish by the normally reserved Chinese press. On the plus side, China's begun deployment of the Chengdu J-20 stealth fighter, somewhat comparable to the U.S.'s F-22 stealth fighter, and have produced and put into service around 200 of them. But this aircraft cannot be adapted to carriers, much like the F-22, and remains a standard land-based air superiority fighter, which limits their range and thus their support of the PLAN. China is, however, focused on creating a new carrier-launched stealth fighter, the FC-31 Gyrfalcon, also known as the J-31, a mid-sized twin-jet 5th-generation fighter aircraft currently in its design and development stages. And though a prototype was spotted going through testing as early as July 2022, a completed and fully functional aircraft might not be deployed until sometime after 2025. No country is standing still. No military force exists in a vacuum. The strength of China's PLAN can only be measured against its likely opponents, and it's clear the longer China waits, the more of its military assets will be coming online. Yet, as they wait to increase their naval strength, the countries surrounding them are doing the same. Their current chief rival, the U.S. Navy, has plans to expand their 300-ship fleet to a massive 500-ship fleet by 2045. While the PLAN is expected to launch more larger ships, the U.S. is doing the opposite, focusing on many smaller ships to spread out its attack posture across a wider number of platforms. Then, of course, there is Taiwan. They've increased their military spending by 14% to a record $19 billion for the fiscal year 2023. Despite such massive increases, they've also asked the United States for an additional $19 billion in military aid, which Congress previously approved in November 2022, though various delays have prevented the aid from reaching Taiwan just yet. Not far behind is Japan, who have just completed 2 new 27,000-ton Izumo-class carriers. They can accommodate up to 7 SH-60K ASW helicopters and 7 MCM-100 mine countermeasure helicopters, along with 400 troops. They're also expected to accommodate both the F-35B, a VSTOL version of the F-35, along with US MV-22 Ospreys for an anticipated future amphibious counterstrike mission. In addition to Japan's first carrier since World War II, their Navy is also committed to building 2 Aegis-equipped destroyers of around 20,000 tons, making them larger than the U.S.'s 15,900-ton Zumwalt destroyers. These are clearly cruisers in everything but name. China has nothing of a comparable size in the PLAN, nor in development. Japan also operates the Maya-class destroyers with a more normal displacement of 8,200 tons, in coordination with 2 older Atago-class and 4 Kong-class destroyers. Just to the south, a 3-way deal is already underway between Australia, the United States, and Great Britain, where Australia will allow the basing of a small number of US and UK nuclear submarines in the port city of Perth in Western Australia, beginning in 2027. Following this move, the Australian government will purchase 3 US-made Virginia-class nuclear cruise missile fast attack subs in the early 2030s. From that point on, Australia and the UK will coordinate in designing and building an all-new, jointly designed fast-attack nuclear submarine currently identified as the SSN AUKUS, using technology from all three countries. India has also added a new carrier to its fleet, the 40,000-ton Vikrant, the first and certainly not the last wholly indigenous carrier designed and built in India. The ship can carry up to 26 fighters like the MiG-29K or the Rafale M, along with 4 helicopters like the Ka-31. There are rumors that India wishes to build a sister ship to the Vikrant, but nothing has yet been confirmed. As an addendum, India has also begun to replace China as one of the go-to sources of high-tech manufacturing. Apple Inc. recently announced that India has assembled more than $7 billion worth of iPhones in the fiscal year ending 2022, signaling Apple and other high-tech companies' moves beyond China. This decision to seek new manufacturing partners other than China is one that will only increase, not decrease in the coming years. These partnerships will help India to expand its homegrown manufacturing base, draining both capital and brain power from China's tech sector. While China is pouring money and resources into modernizing the PLAN, its efforts have been matched by other nations around the region who feel threatened by China's bellicose nature toward Taiwan, as well as its attempts to grab 90% of the South China Sea for itself. At some point, China will have to decide if a continued build-up in parallel with its neighbors is the best solution to dominate the world's ocean, or if they'll decide to go all in with what they have. One thing is certain, the US and its allies must respect the striking power of China's current fleet while awaiting a second Pearl Harbor-like strike. Hopefully this time the US Navy will heed the warnings of the massive buildup by a potential Pacific opponent. Good news, info fans, the world is on the brink of multiple major regional conflicts. That means a ton more content for us to provide for your viewing pleasure. And if you got stock in Northrop Grumman or Rheinmetall, get ready to cash in because 2024 is going to be a hot one. These are the top 10 militaries of 2024. Number 10. Italy. Italy's been a surprising up-and-comer the last few years, outpacing absolute European powerhouse and NATO's favorite bad boy, Turkey. But everyone's least favorite type of bacon is going to have to take a back seat, because Italy is knocking it out of the top 10 altogether. Italy's been a curious case when it comes to defense spending. While publicly its political parties largely played down any ambitions to increase defense spending, a European tradition, secretly the government's been passing a series of defense increases since 2018. Russia's attempt to destroy Russia by invading Ukraine put the spook on the current Italian right-wing government, who vowed increased defense spending to reach NATO's goal of 2% of GDP. Currently, Italy spends only 1.51% of GDP on its defense. Big budget items include 41 more F-35 fighters, which is big news after Italy slashed its plans to buy 131 of the 5th-gen jets down to only 90. The F-35 largely is the reason why Italy has surged past a real military heavyweight like Turkey to take the number 10 spot. Turkey famously was cut out of the F-35 program altogether by US President Barack Obama after it bought S-400 units from Russia. President Obama warned the Turks that Russians could use the platforms to gather data on the F-35s in the Turkish inventory, but he was ignored. Subsequently, he pulled the plug on the F-35 deal altogether. Now, as NATO fleets of F-35s grow, Turkey is left eating their dust despite attempts at a homegrown 5th-generation fighter that have left many skeptical. Italy's also taking its role in Mediterranean defense seriously. Recently, Navy Chief Admiral Enrico Credendino stated that the Italian Navy was critically short on drones and anti-submarine warfare aircraft. He commented that whenever they required such capabilities, they were forced to ask their American allies in Sicily to cover for them. Further, Credendino is looking to boost recruiting to address a critical shortfall of personnel. Currently, Italy cannot guarantee proper crew rotations for its naval fleet, putting undue stress on personnel and significantly limiting operational uptime. Italy's also looking to purchase the American-made HIMARS after its stunning performance in Ukraine. However, it is unknown when it'll get its hands on the weapon system, given the whole global demand for the system that surged in the wake of Russia's invasion. A pressing need for new tanks and armored vehicles is also pushing the Italian government to invest heavily in both. Italy's looking to greatly increase its presence in Africa to combat rising extremism and help ensure continental stability. As part of its refocus on strengthening ties within the United States, and in the wake of Chinese anger over Italy leaving the Belt and Road Initiative, Italy's also looking to expand its ability to project power in the Southeast Pacific theater. This includes a dramatic naval expansion, which will place a focus on anti-submarine warfare and drones. Number 9. France. France is by far Europe's most capable military power, and if you removed the nuclear option from the only other European NATO power ranked above it, it would easily be Europe's most powerful military, period. But France has a critical problem that significantly hampers its odds of rising higher on the list, and it keeps it locked in the number 9 spot. While France fields some of the best combat systems in the world, its focus on quality over quantity means that it doesn't field a lot of them. And this leaves the military incapable of prolonged military campaigns. At even a quarter the rate of equipment loss that Ukraine has faced, France would have capitulated to Russia within months. Well, if it was forced to fight on its own, that is. The war in Ukraine has been costly for France, who is struggling to replace the Caesar howitzers it donated, given that it only started with 70 to begin with. With only about 200 Leclerc tanks, France can ill afford to donate any, and replacing equipment has historically been France's biggest problem. Even the French have admitted that their defense industry struggles to produce replenishment for even low-intensity conflicts in Africa, and currently the company that makes the Caesar howitzer only produces 4 a month. That production is being scaled up to 8 by mid-2024, but the point still stands. France cannot fight an industrialized conflict, even if its technology far outmatches anything an adversary like Russia can throw at it. Sadly, while the US and others look to significantly expand their military stock, France seems stuck in the old post-World War II days. The European power is continuing to bet that high technology, speed, and surprise will be able to inflict catastrophic defeats early on in a conflict, preventing a slow-burning multi-year war like Ukraine. Much like the UK, France's focus has been myopically skewed toward the use of nuclear weapons. Its Air Force and Navy are primarily designed for nuclear missions, and French military doctrine still sees nuclear weapons as the ultimate guarantor against invasion. But the war in Ukraine has shown that major industrial conflicts can still rage without the use of nuclear weapons, and if France found itself tested similarly, it would fail. France's biggest problem is not the quality of its forces or even equipment, but rather that it simply needs more of everything in its inventory. New thinking has penetrated French defense circles, arguing for a focus on adequate technology at large scale, rather than extremely capable technology at extremely low scale. What France needs the most is a happy medium, but for now the nation remains a significant cut above any competitor as long as the war is very short. Number 8. Japan. Japan's place at number 8 on the list is only temporary because the Japan of 2025 will become unrecognizable. Japan is undertaking a 5-year, $315 billion military expansion, the greatest rearmament since World War II. But Hawaii natives can rest easy, because the reason for Japanese military expansion is the increasing power of China, not the US. As China continues to antagonize regional powers through its illegal reclamation of islands to turn them into military fortresses and insistence that all waters in the infamous 9-dash line belong to it, Japan is hoping that a significant increase in military power will deter China from starting a mess in the first place. Japan's also taking lessons from the Ukraine conflict and making a massive investment in increasing the amount of spare parts and other equipment needed for maintenance. This will place the Japanese Defense Forces in an excellent position to weather the high attrition of modern conventional warfare. But more importantly, it'll address current maintenance problems forcing Japanese airplanes to remain grounded. The US and Japan also announced a joint cyber warfare venture, with Japan investing billions into cyber offense and defense, which will feature prominently in any future war. An investment in helicopters and troop landing vessels is aimed directly at denying China the opportunity to seize and hold islands in the disputed Senkaku Islands, a key concern for Japan. Japan is seeking to hit 2% of GDP in defense spending over the next 5 years, with its defense budget expanding to 1/10 of all public spending. This will catapult Japan straight to the number 3 spot of biggest global defense spenders, and it's all aimed at deterring China. But some of Japan's future acquisitions have created significant internal debate over its pacifist status. These include the purchase of about 400 of the latest variant of the American Tomahawk cruise missile at a cost of $1.4 billion. It's also tapping Mitsubishi Heavy Industries to develop 3 new long-range missiles that Japan's planning to add to its arsenal. These missiles will allow Japan to, for the first time, strike inside China itself, which has prompted a bit of a constitutional crisis in the pacifist power. Many have called Japan's military buildup illegal, and yet Japan's leadership remains clear-eyed. In the wake of the stockpiling of thousands of missiles by the Chinese People's Liberation Army Rocket Force and China's plan to build a fleet of supercarriers, Japan can no longer remain safe, striking just beyond its own borders. The nation's having a bit of a domestic problem with its new ambitions, however, mostly because its native industry is not fully on board with the plan. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries is Japan's largest defense company, and yet military sales only account for 1/10 of its total income. Other manufacturers have expressed concerns to the Japanese government that investing into building military hardware simply isn't profitable, and there is significant concern of multi-million-dollar manufacturing plants simply remaining empty after Japan's rearmament is complete. Japan is hoping that by increasing the profit margin from a few percentage points to 15%, it can compel native industries to invest in Japan's rearmament. For now, though, Japanese industry is not ready to meet the challenge, and it'll likely be forced into delaying its massive rearmament or purchasing weapons from foreign sources like the US. Number 7. Pakistan. Pakistan has seen a dramatic rise in power to the number 7 spot globally, largely thanks to exploiting its natural resources. In Pakistan, the military has been described as a military with a nation rather than the other way around, given the military's influence over the Pakistani government. Now Pakistan is in effect a military-run power, and this is causing serious problems that threaten the nation's future. With a defense budget of $7.5 billion and an active duty force of 654,000, Pakistan's military is huge. Its equipment faces significant modernity issues, though it is looking to replace its aging stocks with new hardware. China and Pakistan have inked a deal for the latter to purchase 680 VT-4 main battle tanks, a third-generation model with advanced features. To date, Pakistan has 176 of the tanks, and these are the most modern and capable model out of a fleet of 3,700 MBTs, its most numerous model of its Al-Zarar tank, built in cooperation with China, of which the nation has 750. However, this is a second-generation model that will fare extremely poor against modern armor. Its most numerous armored personnel carrier is the American-made M113, a thoroughly obsolete model that doesn't fare well on the modern battlefield. In second place is its fleet of Italian-made Iveco VM90s, which are literally just trucks, with no protection whatsoever. Pakistan's Air Force is not faring much better, currently being made of a mix of Chinese, American, and French aircraft, though the country is looking to reverse the logistics nightmare by heavily investing in the Chinese-made JF-17s and J-10Cs. However, Pakistan is currently experiencing an economic crisis with no clear solution in sight, with catastrophic inflation, the worst in its history, ravaging the value of the Pakistani rupee. With the military intervening in public affairs, gross financial mismanagement, and a tanking economy, Pakistan's spot on this list does not seem secure. Number 6. South Korea. South Korea, or the Fun Korea as it's known in defense circles, is a military powerhouse because its existence literally depends on it. With some very angry boys on its northern border, South Korea doesn't have the luxury of European countries who don't take their own defense seriously. The nation made news when Poland announced it was snubbing Germany and it'll start purchasing tanks straight from South Korea. This was a monumental accomplishment for South Korea, who had been trying to crack the European defense market for years, and it made South Korea a global defense player for the first time in history. Other nations have followed suit, purchasing a variety of arms from South Korea, including advanced artillery systems. This surge in demand didn't happen just because South Korean arms are good. They are. It's also that the European defense industry has been caught with its strudel out in the wake of the Ukraine war and is overwhelmed with purchase orders. At a time when the U.S. Secretary of Defense was privately telling his British counterpart that the U.S. no longer considered the UK a world-class military power, U.S. officials were praising the South Korean military as one of the best in the world. While European powers struggle with very serious readiness issues, U.S. military leaders noted that South Korea's military was ready to, quote, fight tonight. This is critical for a nation whose northern neighbor has actively called for its destruction. U.S. officials praise the South Korean military so highly because, for all intents and purposes, it's a mirror of the U.S. military. South Korean and U.S. troops train jointly, and to the exact same standards. Both militaries are designed to freely incorporate into one another, allowing them to run joint operations. However, there are troubling signs in the South Korean military. Many within South Korea itself have criticized the government's focus on modernizing and building up its air and naval forces, which is understandable in the wake of an increasingly hostile China. However, this has left the army to be South Korea's red-headed stepchild, and army personnel are increasingly raising the alarm about the shrinking size of its ground combat force. While South Korea hopes that its overwhelming advantage in the air would overcome North Korea's numbers, North Korea still has a whole lot of numbers. With the South Korean defense industry going global, though, the nation is not set to be budged from its spot anytime soon. And if it wasn't for nuclear weapons, we think South Korea would trounce the pants off most other powers above it on the list. Number 5. UK. This one's gonna make a lot of you tea drinkers angry, but the UK doesn't deserve to be in the number 5 spot. The only reason it's in the number 5 spot is because it has nukes. That's it. And that's its biggest problem, as admitted by their own defense analysts. The UK has relied on its nuclear weapons to deter conflict ever since the end of the Cold War, resulting in a military that is half the size that it should be, and one that, by the UK's own admission, lacks the capability to fight on its own for more than a few days. But that's not our hot take, that's coming straight from the UK's own defense sector. After a brief period of outrage, when the US told Defense Secretary Ben Wallace that it no longer considered the UK a top-tier fighting force, British analysts took to the airwaves to admit, sadly, the US's assessment was correct. According to British sources, the nation lacks the capability to weather the type of drone and missile attack Ukraine is facing, and if called upon to fight, the nation would take as much as 10 years to field a 30,000-strong infantry force complete with supporting tanks and helicopters. The UK is in the worst period of military readiness in centuries, and were it to find itself in a more dangerous time, it would have likely ceased to be independent long ago. Well, save for its nukes, but that's its biggest problem. The threat of using nuclear weapons is a strong one, but the UK has used its nuclear shield to absolutely atrophy its once world-renowned fighting forces. The UK's problems are numerous, from a lack of defense investment to continued personnel cuts. The British military does have some top-tier weaponry. Storm Shadow missiles have proven their deadly effectiveness in Ukraine and given Russia its single greatest headache since the introduction of HIMARS. But the problem is that the nation has these types of weapons in very low numbers, and its defense industry is not even remotely prepared to replace them. The UK finds itself dealing with a post-Brexit economic downturn made worse by the COVID pandemic. Now, inflation is putting yet another nail in the coffin of the UK's military budget. Yet, despite this, British leaders have at last come to terms with the fact that their military is no longer a combat-credible force. The UK does have aircraft carriers, but to man them must cannibalize crews from other ships, and a scenario where both the British Air Force and the British Naval Air Force operate simultaneously is extremely unlikely. The nation currently must prioritize one over the other. A dwindling fleet and lackluster recruitment number only adds to the UK's woes, as does equipment that is rapidly aging out of service with no replacements anywhere in sight. The only reason it's made it to the 5th spot on the list is because of its potent nuclear arsenal, but in a conventional war, pretty much every power below it on the list would defeat the UK in short order. Number 4. India. The pupil has surpassed the master. Once a colony of the United Kingdom, today if India wanted to, it could probably make the UK its colony. India has a massive population, giving it an incredible pool of available manpower in case of an emergency. The nation also has a modern, robust military with a respectable air and naval force capable of power projection far from its own borders. As a member of the Carrier Club, India is very well suited to protecting its interests even far from its own shores. But India has its problems too. The nation finds itself at a crossroads, facing a full-blown military crisis in the near future. Historically, India has been closer to Russia than the US and its Western partners, and Russia has been India's biggest provider of arms. However, as China rapidly modernizes and the serious deficiencies in the Russian weapons have been exposed by the war in Ukraine, India is facing the troubling proposition of fighting its next war with an obsolete military. India's biggest geopolitical headaches are China and Pakistan, and while India is more than capable of dealing with the Pakistani threat, the two nations have joined up in a decidedly anti-Indian axis. China represents an uphill battle for India, and the nation is modernizing faster than India is. The situation is severe enough for India to break its close relationship with Russia and seek closer ties with the US, and most importantly with the US defense industry. Much of India's arsenal is of Russian origin, and the world has gotten a good look at how well Russian equipment fares against even small arsenals of Western weapons. This has shaken confidence globally in Russian arms, and the nation's arms sales have dropped precipitously in the wake of its invasion of Ukraine. But Russia's low quality was already evident years ago, when India broke off its cooperation with Russia in development of the Su-57. After millions invested in the effort, Indian engineers finally realized that Russia's Su-57 would never be able to match the F-35 or F-22 in neither stealth nor capabilities, and the nation decided to pull the plug. This effectively crippled Russia's Su-57 program, as the nation was unable to meet the budgetary demands all on its own. And it's the biggest reason for the lack of an operational aircraft today. India knows it desperately needs to modernize its aging air fleet, and now there's serious concerns about even tried and true Russian systems due to the nation's war in Ukraine and major supply delays. The US smelled an opportunity, and in February of 2023 they sent F-16s, F-18 Super Hornets, F-35s, and B-1B Lancers to take part in an air show in India. Meanwhile, Russia's largest defense company, Rosoboronexport, had a shared stall where it displayed miniature models of aircraft, trucks, radars, and tanks. Yep, toys. The impact was huge on Indian defense circles, and while F-35s are not on the table yet, there has been growing interest in purchasing U.S. weapon systems to modernize the Indian military. There is significant resistance to purchasing American weapons, though, or even more Russian ones, as the nation looks to build up its own native defense sector. This is a preferred capability, as it would free its military from relying on foreign logistics and suppliers, while strengthening its own economy and its tech sector. But while India has many talented engineers and scientists, they lack the experience necessary for a modern, thriving defense sector. This can be corrected in time and with experience, but India might not have that time thanks to the growing pressure from China. For now, India's saving grace is the mountainous border between itself and China, which makes invasion from the north impossible, and strengthening its partnership with America, which would react strongly to a Chinese attack on India, and its sizable stockpile of modern nuclear arms. We predict that as Russia diminishes, India will soon take one of the top 3 spots, though. Number 3. Russia. Russia was once the world's second strongest military power, except it probably wasn't, and we were all just drinking the Vladimir-flavored Kool-Aid. Just months before its catastrophic invasion of Ukraine, major publications routinely ran articles touting the capabilities of the modern Russian military, a true combined arms force that inspired more than its fair share of U.S. defense spending. We are no different. We reported the exact same thing Western analysts were saying for years about the Russian military, but, as it's famously been said, war doesn't tolerate bullshit. If you claim that your tanks are the best in the world, well, the enemy gets a rebuttal in that conversation. And Ukraine's rebuttal against Russia's most modern tanks has been brutal. Though it wouldn't be fair to say Russia's best is bad. In truth, some of the best equipment is really quite good. It's just that there is exceedingly little of it. Russia's Su-35 is an extremely capable 4.5-gen fighter. It's so deadly that Russia's own air defenses blasted one out of the sky, despite literally having just been modernized. A few days later, they did it again. The answer to the proverbial question of what air defense doing seems to be blasting its own most modern jets out of the sky. Now, to be fair, it's difficult to accurately judge just how good Russian equipment is, mostly because without fail, its biggest flaw is the human element. Russian troops suck. This is the professional observation of a global defense analyst. They are poorly trained, they have low morale, and practically no discipline. Put some of the best equipment in the hands of some of the worst troops in the world, and the results will be predictable. For instance, we know for a fact that Russia's electronic warfare equipment is really quite good. It is so good that Russia had to turn it off because it was blocking its own communications and electronic signals. Quick side note, thanks Russia for abandoning your most modern EW vehicle right outside Kyiv in perfect working condition so NATO intelligence could tear it apart inch by inch. If you got a Ferrari, but you drive it like a tractor, it's hard to judge the true merits of said Ferrari. Then again, when we've seen Russia's most modern weapons in a fight, the results were lackluster. Russia bragged about its, quote, hypersonic missile, the Kinzhal. As soon as American Patriot air defense batteries joined the chat, Russia's Kinzhals started going boom, tens of thousands of feet above places they were meant to go boom at. The world has taken note, too. Not only are Russian arms sales significantly down, but American arms sales have actually increased dramatically as demand for U.S. systems seeing action in Ukraine is going through the roof. The bulk of the Russian military is, well, as bad as you can imagine. It was already operating borderline museum-grade equipment when it poked the hornet's nest that is Ukraine, making the modern Russian military a self-fulfilling joke as it operates vehicles and weapons built in the immediate aftermath of World War II. The only reason Russia remains so high on this list is due to 2 reasons. The first is its nukes, of which it has the largest stockpile in the world, or at least that's what it claims. After what we've seen the last 2 years, nobody would be much surprised to find out most of Russia's arsenal had been sold off at the nearest flea market by conscripts. There are serious questions about just how effective the remainder of its stockpiles are, and of the nuclear weapons that Russia does have that legitimately work. Its own air defenses would probably end up destroying the aircraft or the missiles trying to deliver them. Russia's also very big, and its equipment stockpiles are some of the deepest in the world. Russia is basically a hoarder state. In preparation for an apocalyptic war with the US and its allies, the old Soviet Union stockpiled everything it possibly could, no matter how obsolete it was. That tactic had merit too. If it wasn't for those vast strategic reserves, Russia's already catastrophic war would have gone much worse. Number 2. China. China has supplanted Russia in a relationship that began back in the Cold War, and it's now without a doubt the second most powerful military in the world. The rise of the Chinese military mirrors the meteoric rise of the nation itself. In the 1990s, the Chinese military was so weak it couldn't even challenge a single carrier America sailed between Taiwan and China during the Third Taiwan Strait crisis. But today, China's military has grown significantly in power to the point of now fielding the world's largest naval force. Though here, we need some caveats, because the US Navy still outnumbers it by almost 50% in number of battle force missiles, and the US Navy displaces 4.5 million tons versus the Chinese Navy's 2 million tons. While China might have more ships, the US has more capable ships. However, China's made it very difficult for the US to fight any war in the Pacific. In a strategy known as anti-access area denial, China's created significant sea-air conundrums for the US Navy in the form of long-range strike aircraft, over-the-horizon radars, and the largest missile force in the world. The People's Liberation Army Rocket Force is one of a kind. It's dedicated to missile warfare, and its series of anti-ship ballistic missiles are a significant threat to US naval assets and bases in the region. The J-20 has proven itself to be a competent 5th-gen fighter, even if it lacks more advanced systems and stealth characteristics of the American F-35 or the soon-to-be-retired F-22. However, with the fleet suspected to be at over 200 and growing, China is the only nation in the world that can actually challenge the US Air Force. Its naval power is growing by leaps and bounds as well. Not only does China have more shipyards than the US, its largest shipyard is bigger than all US shipyards put together. While the US still retains the mass and missile advantage, it won't matter if China can simply zerg the US Navy with sheer numbers. With the Type 003 carrier coming online soon, China will be the only other nation to build a carrier capable of challenging a US supercarrier. But that is if China can fix serious problems with its carrier fighter program, which represents the nation's biggest Achilles heel, an immature defense sector. While far more capable than India's defense sector, China's modern defense industry is built almost entirely on stolen Western and Russian technology. As has been observed before, China has proven it extremely adept at stealing and reverse engineering military technology, but far less so at developing said technology on its own. This threatens to place the Chinese defense industry in permanent second place to Western firms, as the nation lacks not just experience but precision in modern manufacturing, as evidenced by its reliance on Western and South Korean tooling machines. China is capable of correcting course, but faces serious roadblocks as the world has moved to block the Chinese economy from gaining access to the most advanced computer chips. At every turn, China faces increasing hurdles to fulfilling its ambitions of taking the #1 spot. And truthfully, it's unknown just how good the Chinese military is. The nation has not fought a war since the 1970s, and only recently established a joint command for its military. With so much of its military doctrine inherited from the Soviet Union, China risks facing the same catastrophe as Russia in an attempt to invade Taiwan or otherwise push the US out of the Pacific for good. Number 1. USA. In the top spot, it's the United States of America, the nation that invented freedom and global Cold War companionship title belt holder for 32 years in a row. It's a country that'll kill a terrorist earning 20 cents a day with a missile that costs $100 million to develop. And when you complain of collateral damage, it'll just spend millions to kill you with flying swords. There's 3 things America does best: freedom, winning NFL World Championship titles, and fighting wars. Unlike Russia, when the US develops a new weapon system and states its capabilities, the world leans in to listen. The nation has both the largest bald eagle population and best defense industry, which we assure you is not a coincidence. Americans may not have healthcare and take Ubers to the emergency room because they'll never financially recover from an ambulance ride, but they have 11 carrier strike groups with enough combined firepower to be a top 10 military all on its own. Long ago, the US decided the best way to win a war was to wage it with the best technology around. Like any large military with literally millions of individual weapon systems, the US has some modernity issues, but these are few and actively becoming overcome. Plans to overhaul the US military, however, met with catastrophic failures in the 2000s, partly due to a shift in priorities to the low-intensity anti-terrorism conflicts, and partly because the US military went on a multi-year bender where it wasted entire nations' worth of GDP on utter boondoggles. The US Army's Future Combat Warrior program was supposed to field soldiers from the battlefields of the 41st millennium. Every piece of soldier equipment was to receive a huge technological upgrade to give each soldier unsurpassed overmatch over any adversary. In the end, after billions of dollars spent, the US Army discovered that implementing technology is, hard. Putting that technology on systems designed to be worn or carried by soldiers in a battlefield is significantly harder. So with a collective shrug to the billions of dollars wasted with no results, the Army gave up on the entire affair. The US Air Force was forced to spend astronomical sums to bring the F-35 online. But the worst offender by far is the US Navy, who should legitimately be investigated as a potential insider threat due to the incredible amounts of money it spent on garbage. In a secret attempt to destroy America by bankrupting it, the Navy invested into multiple utter boondoggle programs, like the Zumwalt and Littoral Combat Ship. The former would prove to have a main gun that couldn't be used, mostly because its ammunition cost $1 million a shot. The latter would produce a ship so incapable of even peacetime service that its operators have taken to calling it the Little Crappy Ship. To make matters worse, Congress refuses to cancel production contracts on a ship widely hailed as being completely non-survivable in a combat scenario. America's problem was too many investments in too many immature technologies, which led to a collective gasp of surprise as the excitement wore off and the US realized that China had significantly closed the gap between itself and the US. However, what systems the US does field are world-class, and it fields a whole lot of them. Russia continues to find it difficult to counter the effects of 24 Ukrainian HIMARS. The US has 450 left in its inventory. The F-35 has proven to be everything promised, well, everything except cheap. And the US is adding over 100 airframes to its inventory every year, prompting some Chinese analysts to comment that the time for China to challenge the US is shrinking. The US also has major updates for every major combat platform already in development. Even with only a fraction of the US air fleet consisting of F-35s, both the US Air Force and Navy are developing a 6th-generation replacement, and the Air Force has already flown its version. Ford-class carriers will continue to come online over the next decade, with the first of its class deployed on its first combat deployment to support regional stability in the wake of the conflict between Israel and Hamas. America's fleet of cruisers and destroyers will soon be phased out by their replacements, and the B-21 Raider will start rolling off factory floors within months of this script. To back all of this up, the US military takes training very seriously, routinely hosting realistic training exercises both at home and abroad with coalition partners. The US military is an extremely credible force. The threat posed by a single carrier strike group has historically been enough to quell most simmering conflicts. What truly makes the US military an insurmountable opponent, though, is its global network of partners and allies. History's most broad military coalition that literally circles the globe. When you mess with the US, you aren't just getting the best the US has to offer, you're inevitably getting the best from any number of US partners. As long as the US Navy doesn't continue trying to bankrupt America by destroying its bank account, the US seems set to continue dominating the world with its stolen UFO technology as the world's #1 military. In the 1984 film Red Dawn, the beleaguered Wolverines, teen partisans defending the middle of America against a Soviet and Cuban invasion, ask a downed US fighter pilot, played by Powers Booth, what started the war. His answer? The two toughest kids on the block, I guess. Sooner or later, they're gonna fight. That's the way many analysts see the current situation between the United States and its allies, primarily NATO, and China and its main military ally, Russia. With all the military spending on both sides, it only seems inevitable that they will eventually use the power they've built up to forward their global agendas. The current situation between the authoritarian East and liberal West has not been this tense in about half a century. The invasion of Ukraine has brought NATO and the United States into as close to an all-out hot war with Russia as we've seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. But with that previous series of events cooled off before shots fired, the Ukrainian war has seen hundreds of thousands of casualties. Russia feels that many of the deaths on their side are due to the military and economic aid sent by NATO and the US to Ukraine. Putin and his political henchmen have repeatedly threatened NATO with nuclear weapons if they feel the existence of their country is threatened any more than it already is. Matters weren't made any better when Great Britain almost had one of its RC-135 reconnaissance planes shot down in September 2022, which would have raised tensions even more. There was another close call in November of 2022 when an errant Ukrainian air defense missile missed its intended target, another Russian missile barrage indiscriminately targeting Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, and landed in neighboring Poland, killing 2 people. NATO has a very specific section of its agreement called Article 5, which states that any attack on a member nation is an attack on all of NATO. For a moment, talks of all-out war between Russia and NATO filled the blogosphere. Russian officials have sought to paint NATO as aggressors in the war, continually claiming that the poor little Russia was directly fighting against the massive enemy of NATO, while the US and its allies have said they are supporting Ukraine's defense with military aid and unspecified intelligence sharing, but not with boots on the ground. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, China continues to make threatening gestures toward Taiwan, including recent armed jet intrusions of Taiwanese airspace following Speaker Pelosi's trip to the island in 2022, and then Speaker McCarthy's trip in 2023. Following the more recent April trip, China effectively closed Taiwan's airspace with waves of fighter jets and for the first time made it seem like they were able to interdict any U.S. support from the east of the island. There is even talk that China might begin to require ships transiting the Taiwan Strait to undergo boarding and searching, which Taiwan says they will vigorously oppose. Are we close to a hot war? First off, let's make one thing clear. The U.S. and China are not on the verge of war. On March 31, 2023, General Mark Milley, the chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, "I don't think at this point I would put the possibility of imminent war in the likely category, and I think that the rhetoric itself can overheat the environment." However, General Milley did admit that it is possible that you could have an incident or some other trigger event that could lead to uncontrolled escalation, so it's not impossible. That incident would most likely evolve around an attempted Chinese invasion of Taiwan. President Xi has publicly stated that he wants the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, to be prepared to take Taiwan by force as early as 2027, so that risk clearly does exist. Let's take a look at the two main theaters of such a potential war. NATO and the European elements of the United States' forces arrayed against Russia, and the U.S. forces in the Pacific, mostly naval forces, against the might of the Chinese Army and Navy. Of course, such a comparison will not include the opposing nuclear forces. Any of the combatants have enough warheads to turn vast swaths of the world into unlivable nuclear wasteland. For the purposes of this comparison, we will hope that all sides would agree not to resort to such catastrophic weapons. The opposing military strengths in Europe. Before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, most of the world perceived Russia as the second most powerful military in the world. They had massive numbers of tanks and artillery, their air force was seen as a peer with the American Air Force, and their navy was capable and feared, even if it didn't have comparable numbers to the U.S. Navy. Russia's military fiasco in Ukraine has proven their tanks are outdated and poorly designed. Their logistics vanish once they leave their rail network, and their air force has been fragile enough that they don't dare fly over Ukrainian territory for fear of being shot down. The only two legs of their military that remain unbowed by these defeats are its artillery, still numerous, though notably inaccurate, and its nuclear forces, which remain unused and still unproven. As of April 2023, the widely respected research organization Oryx has documented and confirmed an astounding 10,000 vehicle losses by the Russian armed forces, including over 1,900 main battle tanks, half of what it reportedly had pre-invasion, along with 830 armored fighting vehicles, 2,200 infantry fighting vehicles, 800 pieces of artillery, 79 aircraft, 81 helicopters, and 12 surface vessels, including the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, the Slava-class guided missile cruiser Moskva. This is in addition to an estimated 200,000 Russian military casualties, with anything between 45,000 to 50,000 killed in action. These numbers are incredibly high from just over a year of fighting, and are far greater even than what Russia suffered in its 10-year losing war in Afghanistan. The losses are so high that in early 2023, Russia began returning 75-year-old T-54-55s into service, the equivalent of the U.S. using Korean War-era M47s. The Russia also lost a reported 1,500 officers, including 160 top-level generals and colonels, and it's clear the once-feared Russian military is a shell of its former self. Standing opposite the vastly depleted and shaken Russian military is NATO, now more united and stronger than at any time in its 74-year history. With Finland's admission into NATO in April of 2023 as its 31st signatory nation, the organization can now boast a combined troop strength of just over 3.5 million soldiers, airmen, and sailors. That includes, however, the U.S. and its 1.4 million strong standing army, not all of which would be fighting in Europe, and Turkey's 425,000, not the most committed of NATO's members. That means the rest of NATO's 29 members contribute only 1.7 million troops total. France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Poland, and Italy each have 160,000 or more active personnel, while other countries have smaller forces to rely on. It must be stated, though, NATO considers itself a defensive organization. How involved they'd be beyond their own borders is anyone's guess. It's important to note that the current war in Ukraine has shown that the NATO members, mostly led by Poland and the US, are willing to supply lethal aid from missiles to artillery to tanks and fighter jets to a non-signatory nation whose defense is of a vital interest to nearby NATO members. Since Russia launched its invasion in February of 2022, NATO members have increased both their military budgets and pledged a greater amount of military spending per capita. They've also benefited from sending Ukraine their Soviet-era tanks and fighter jets, which have been replaced with upgraded models, many of them being state-of-the-art models from other member nations, like the US's F-35 stealth fighter and M1A2 Abrams tanks. NATO can also count on around 1,500 Leopard 2s and about 2,500 M1 Abrams main battle tanks, the majority of which are M1A2s, with the rest being the earlier M1A1s, with an additional 800 or so British Challenger 2s and French Leclerc and Ariettes. And while the number of aircraft on both the NATO and Russian sides appear about equal, NATO forces employ more 4th and 5th generation fighters like the F-35 and the improved and updated versions of the F-16. While Russia is still reliant on more outdated MiG-29s introduced in 1982, MiG-31s introduced in 1981, and the Su-27s introduced in 1985. These three plane types alone account for more than 750 of their total 1,100 available pre-invasion fighter aircraft, a disproportionate number of outdated and non-modernized platforms. And as has been seen in Ukraine, many of these aircraft have not been maintained sufficiently in order for them to be combat-ready anytime soon. It's clear that a war between only the European forces of NATO and the struggling military of Russia would be a one-sided affair. But how would China fare against a mostly US force? The opposing forces in the Pacific. China, it should be obvious, has not suffered from an equivalent loss of military strength as Russia has over the past year. In fact, the modernization and expansion of its military has been impressive and has caused its neighbors like Japan, Australia, India, and the Philippines to increase their own military expenditures. Yet China is still missing major components that will allow it to go toe-to-toe with the US Navy. These missing elements suggest China would be better off waiting at least 5 years, and possibly as much as 10 years, before it initiates an open military confrontation with the West. For example, the People's Liberation Army Navy, the Plan, currently operates 25 of its modern 10,000-ton Type 52D destroyers, with its own version of the Aegis-type radar system, along with 8 of the more advanced 13,000-ton Type 55A destroyers, along with 6 of the earlier 7,000-ton Type 52C ships. There are up to 12 additional destroyers currently under construction. But while these ships are designed specifically for missile and aircraft defenses, they've yet to deploy with the planned HQ-26 medium-range ship-to-air missile system, which was based on the Russian 9K-37 Buk, first developed in 1972. This new missile system is reportedly equivalent to the US SM-3 missile used by the Aegis ballistic missile defense system and was expected to be able to engage short and medium-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and both manned and unmanned aircraft out to 400 kilometers. However, this capability is expected to be implemented around a year or two from first deployment and will be even longer before it's deployed fleet-wide. Until then, China's missile defense destroyers like the Type 52 and 55 will have to make do with the upgraded HQ-16B with a reported maximum range of only 70 kilometers, a system that dates from 2011. The biggest weakness in the plan, of course, is its aircraft carrier fleet. They currently operate 3 carriers, the oldest being a 90s-era Ukrainian-built Russian-designed ship named the Liaoning with its ski jump ramp, which is also a staple of its second carrier, the Type 002 Shandong. The Liaoning isn't really considered a frontline carrier and is relegated to the role of training carrier. Its third carrier, the Fujian, currently being fitted out, is equipped with advanced electromagnetic catapults, similar to those on the U.S. supercarrier USS Gerald R. Ford. Some say copied directly from it. But that means the plan will have to train its carrier pilots on 2 types of takeoffs, and they'll need 2 different types of carrier planes to operate on those carriers. Its current training model, the JL-9G, a single-engine twin-seat aircraft first deployed in 2011, can't be used to duplicate emergency landings on any of its current carriers because it's too weak to take the continual pounding of carrier landings, and it's too underpowered to immediately take off in case of a missed landing. That leaves only simulated takeoffs and landings on ground-based mock-ups. This inability to field a true carrier trainer has led to a huge deficit in trained carrier pilots. The problem with the planned trainer is just the opposite of its carrier combat aircraft, the J-15 Flying Shark, which was mocked by Russia for trying to be a back-engineered version of a Su-33 prototype, the T-10K-3, which they bought from Ukraine back in 2001. At a reported 17.5 tons, its upgraded version is now thought to be the world's heaviest carrier-borne fighter. In comparison, the U.S. Navy's FA-18 weighs only 14.5 tons. The J-15 suffers from either having to carry less than optimal fuel, giving it less range, or less armament, giving it less lethality if it intends to take off from the two ski jump-equipped carriers. It has since been nicknamed the flopping fish by the normally reserved Chinese press for its underwhelming performance. China's begun deployment of the Chengdu J-20, somewhat comparable to the US's F-22 stealth fighter, and have produced around 200 of them, but this aircraft cannot be adapted to carriers and remains a standard land-based air superiority fighter. China hopes to make up the difference in carrier forces with hypersonic missiles, though their reliability and readiness is still under discussion. At present, there's speculation but no confirmation that China is building a fourth carrier, though at least one recent satellite image suggests a fourth might be under construction. But the plan doesn't have enough carrier pilots for its two current frontline carriers, let alone a fourth. In comparison, the U.S. currently operates 11 carrier strike groups, each of which is comprised of one of its nuclear propulsion Nimitz or Ford-class supercarriers able to field 70 to 80 aircraft, one or two Ticonderoga-class Aegis-guided missile cruisers for air defense and coordination, two LAMPS-capable warships focusing on anti-submarine and surface warfare, and 2 to 3 Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers. Each strike group is accompanied by assorted logistics and support ships and an undisclosed number of nuclear-powered attack submarines, usually 1 or 2, that coordinate with each strike group. The new Ford-class supercarriers currently in use by the U.S. Navy are undoubtedly the most powerful warships ever produced, with 1 in service and 4 more planned or currently under construction to be delivered between 2024 and 2034. There are literally no carrier groups of such lethality in any navy in the world, though the British and French navies do have their own carrier battle groups with somewhat comparable strengths. The U.S. also deploys several amphibious-ready groups built around the Wasp-class amphibious assault ships, in essence a small carrier, which can handle 6 fighters like the F-35 Lightning II and up to 24 helicopters like the Cobra gunship and the VF-22 Osprey transport vehicles. The amphibious-ready groups also include a landing platform dock ship, LPD, from the San Antonio class, capable of deploying up to 600 troops and 14 amphibious assault vehicles, and a landing ship dock, LSD, like the Harper's Ferry class and the Whidbey Island class landing ships, which can load and unload conventional landing craft and helicopters. These amphibious-ready groups can also launch dozens of autonomous drones like the X-47B. Normally 2 to 3 ARGs are forward deployed, 1 in the Mediterranean Sea or the Persian Gulf/Indian Ocean region, and 1 or 2 in the Western Pacific Ocean area. Currently, 1 ARG is based out of Sasebo and Okinawa, Japan. The ARGs are usually attached to a carrier strike group which provides protection for them from both land and sea-based attacks. The U.S. can also count on 26 Los Angeles-class, 3 Seawolf-class, and 21 Virginia-class nuclear-powered attack submarines, as well as dozens of ballistic missile submarines, each with ICBM-capable launch tubes. On the other hand, the plan operates 6 Shang-class nuclear submarines and 40 older diesel-electric submarines of much lower capability. Many experts point to the plan's superiority in total numbers of ships over the U.S. Navy, 340 to 300, but we must consider that the plan's numbers include 150 patrol craft, which are more equivalent to the U.S. Coast Guard's cutters, designed for coastal engagements only, and not really capable of the kind of blue water combat the main naval units would engage in. In addition, while the U.S. Navy appears perfectly capable of handling the current plan on its own, any shooting war will likely involve other countries that are either wary of or outright opposed to Chinese naval power projection, including Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, and India. Following continued efforts by China to claim the entire South China Sea as their own personal swimming pool, each of these countries has begun to beef up their own naval might. Japan, for instance, is building 2 of the largest destroyers in the world. At 20,000 tons, they dwarf even the U.S.'s 16,000-ton Zumwalt destroyers. These will complement and support Japan's 2 new Izumo and Kaga carriers, converted from previous helicopter destroyers, and will operate the F-35B Joint Strike Fighter. Once complete, the 2 carriers will be Japan's first since the Second World War. Along with Japan's increasing naval might, Australia has entered into a long-term agreement with the U.S. and Great Britain to build a fleet of state-of-the-art nuclear-powered attack submarines. India has also increased its own naval strength, while the country is still aching from violent confrontations instigated by China along its northern Himalayan border. China's true Achilles heel. And that brings up the most crucial component of any possible shooting war involving China: The fact that the country must import 70 to 75% of all their oil and natural gas through a long naval route from the Baltic through the Atlantic and past Africa, India, and Indonesia. If the US or its Pacific allies wanted to interdict the flow of petroleum to China, and such a lengthy supply chain would be impossible for China to protect, then China would be looking at a 3-month delay before its countrywide truck transport system would shut down due to a lack of fuel, and 6 months before it ran out of the necessary components for the production of fertilizers which its farmers desperately need. Their economy would collapse within a year, and massive famine would break out even if they did manage to hold off the superior US Navy. This dramatic and inevitable failure of their economy and the catastrophic famine that would follow might be the main reason why China isn't looking to launch a full-scale war anytime soon. Not only is it a heavy importer of raw petroleum, it's also the world's largest importer of food. Between 2000 and 2020, the country's food self-sufficiency ratio decreased from 93.6% to 65.8%. China's leaders know that if it cannot win a war outright in a very short period of a few months, and the vast capabilities of the US Navy, let alone its numerous Pacific allies, suggest that this just isn't a reliable possibility, then they are dooming their country to losing their position as the second most powerful economy in the world, with a disastrous famine soon to follow. The lessons of the Ukraine war are also a stark reminder that a determined, well-equipped country, no matter how small, can resist an invader far more easily with today's advanced technological weapons. And while Ukraine has done a phenomenal job in gaining that capability in a mere 8 years since the first Russian invasion of 2014, Taiwan has been preparing itself for a Chinese invasion for more than 70 years. They're also a much more technologically capable nation and have a large 80-mile moat of an ocean that China would have to navigate in case of an invasion. This would not be an easy cross-border incursion that Russia attempted and failed, but it would require dozens of landing craft, easy targets for missiles, and waiting artillery. The fragility of a Russia-China alliance. In addition to logistical problems of overcoming the US Navy and the watery moat around Taiwan, China faces another hurdle: the weakness of any long-term alliance with Russia, an alliance that would merely be a castle built upon sand. Any full-scale war short of a nuclear engagement would find Russia's military virtually destroyed within the first few weeks of the conflict's launch, leaving China virtually alone. The Ukrainian invasion has spotlighted why Russia is nowhere near the military peer to the US, China, or even NATO that people thought it was. As previously mentioned, the Russian armed forces have lost over 10,000 military vehicles, including upwards of 1,900 main battle tanks, along with around 200,000 troops. The main reason they threaten the West so often with nuclear weapons is because they know they never stand a chance against the combined forces of NATO, which have more advanced equipment and better trained troops, and now might actually hold a numerical advantage as well. There are multiple reasons for the failure of the Russian military. First and foremost is the endemic corruption that riddles every layer of the Russian government, including the military. There are estimates that corruption has cost from 25 to 30% of Russia's total annual GDP, and the sanctions Russia has endured since the start of the war has caused a massive drain of its remaining economy. Not only is Russia's economy collapsing due to the surprisingly efficient Western sanctions, but that smaller economy's spending on its military is actually much less than the projected numbers. The sanctions have also shrunk the Russian economy to the size of Italy, and now puts it behind the individual states of California, Texas, or New York. Russia's nominal $1.4 trillion GDP is minuscule when compared to the EU's combined economic strength of about $15.28 trillion. Add the US and the EU's GDP together, you get about $35 trillion, more than 40% of the total world GDP. Russia will simply never be able to outspend the EU and its NATO counterpart, much less the US and EU combined. Second, Russia's never had a coherent NCO training program. Russia has lost at least 150 officers of colonel rank and above simply because their orders have to be passed almost directly from the leadership to the frontline troops. The members of NATO, the US, and even China understand that the sergeants and other NCOs have to have the independent authority to assess the war from the front lines and make immediate and effective changes in response. Russia has never had that level of independence, which leads their military to dogmatic, inflexible attacks that usually require masses of tanks, waves of infantry, and massive artillery bombardments, none of which are effective in a modern battlefield environment that is overwatched by drones, surveillance satellites, and reconnaissance planes. Third, Russia has never had the ability to manage their logistics at any distance from their rail network. The ignominious 40-mile-long traffic jam north of Kyiv from late February to March of 2022 was one glaring example of how their military cannot perform the simple task of keeping their tanks and transports full of fuel and moving. This lack of logistics has been further exacerbated by the introduction of HIMARS long-range rocket artillery systems, which can hit targets over 50 miles away, and newer smart ammunition including ground-launched small-diameter bombs, GLSDB, which can hit targets 93 miles away. These have been used to great success by the Ukrainian forces against Russian depots that have often been placed too close to the front, mostly due to their lack of logistical transport capabilities. The inherent weakness of an unequal partnership. There are additional signs that China is aware of Russia's much weaker role in any potential alliance and has been capitalizing on this inequality for some time now. At first, it was the Soviet Union that held a predominant role in any bilateral negotiations, allowing them to bully China into accepting unequal agreements. Things got so bad that the two countries almost launched a major war over a border dispute in 1969, one of several border disputes between the two countries since the 1920s. But Russia eventually decided it was better to arm the Chinese government in order to have an ally against the West. China, however, decided on its own that it'd be better to copy and/or steal whatever they could get, rather than pay the full price for products coming from the Soviet Union. Starting in the 1990s, China has openly copied or stolen Russian technology, leading at times to Russia having to swallow their pride as China sold knockoffs of their own frontline equipment. For example, in 1996, China debuted the J-11 aircraft, the first fighter made after the fall of the Soviet Union to feature significant Russian input. At first, it was an officially licensed Chinese-made copy of the Russian Su-27 multi-role fighter, whose sales were welcomed by the cash-poor post-Soviet state. Before long, however, China canceled their agreement and began producing the aircraft independently, eventually building over 400 unauthorized J-11s, equaling an economic loss to the USSR of more than $10 billion. Russia continues to sell its best or almost best military gear to China, even though they know the technology is likely to be copied, reducing what little technological superiority Russia still maintains over China. The policy dilemma has been compounded by the post-Ukraine effect on Russia's struggling manufacturing sector, which has left the shrinking Russian economy increasingly reliant on China's much larger economic base, further eroding any remaining compatibility in their relationship. More recently, President Xi has tried to bring China to the forefront in worldwide diplomacy. So when the UN held a vote to condemn the Russian invasion, China surprisingly abstained from the 141-5 vote to condemn the invasion, and in fact was a key leader of 34 other countries who also abstained. This was the first time that China had a chance to publicly support their, quote, partner, and they openly refused. This hands-off approach demonstrates China's desire to maintain its currently neutral stance regarding the Ukraine war in hopes of trying to establish Beijing's bid for global leadership. But they can't do that if they supplied lethal aid to Russia, so they refuse to supply such support despite Putin's pleas to the contrary. When President Putin and Xi met in Russia of March 2023, Putin had hoped that Xi would offer a deal to create a direct pipeline between the two countries, making China more reliant on Russian crude oil and natural gas and giving Russia a direct buyer for their primary export. But no such agreement was reached. Xi did say publicly that China and Russia would continue to resolutely uphold the fundamental norms of international relations based on the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. But that statement blatantly ignores the illegality of Russia's invasion in the first place, which directly violates the Charter's core precepts. Putin's hopes for any concrete agreements for aid or mutual development never materialized. The summit was summed up by historian Sergei Radchenko with an old Chinese proverb, "Loud thunder but few raindrops." He then modified that statement as, "Scratch that, even the thunder wasn't all that loud." In fact, the Putin-Xi meetings actually caused further support for Ukraine, as Japanese Prime Minister Kishida used the opportunity to make a surprise trip to Ukraine to meet with President Zelensky. Despite Xi's efforts to lead China into a role of peacekeeper and world negotiator, he still has to deal with the hawks in his own government. On the heels of the Moscow summit, the Guangming Daily wrote an extensive article, more of a semi-official position piece declaring the four no's that China says they will not put up with. Number 1, the US should not make irresponsible remarks on normal exchanges between sovereign states. Number 2, the US should not compare China-Russia relations with a small circle of US allies. Number 3, the US should not undermine China's efforts to promote peace talks on the Ukraine issue. Number 4, the US should stop using the Ukraine crisis as an excuse to attack and sanction China. Some of this rhetoric is no doubt simply strong words, but they may also signal an effort to lay the groundwork for China to ramp up its military support for Russia's war, though so far there's no evidence of that. It gets worse for Russia. In addition to everything else that bodes ill for Russia, President Xi might not be willing to go all in on supporting a leader of Russia whose future appears very uncertain. Putin's been rumored to be in ill health for years. He was filmed walking with a limp when he visited Crimea in March of 2023. And in April, there were widespread reports that he had suffered from intense head pain, a numb tongue, and blurred vision. There have been numerous indications he might be suffering from Parkinson's disease, which manifests as an uncontrollable shaking in the extremities, primarily the hands and feet. And there are additional signs he might be undergoing chemotherapy, which can result in excessive weight gain. There's also signs that Putin has killed off anyone near him that might pose a threat to his continued dominance of the Russian government. Since just before the invasion of Ukraine, over 40 of Russia's top managers, businessmen, and high-level officials have died under unclear but very suspicious circumstances. Those deaths include being found in apparent murder-suicides, like Vladislav Aveyev, vice president of Gazprom Bank, and his pregnant wife and 13-year-old daughter, who were found dead in a Moscow apartment, while a former top manager of Novatek, Sergei Protosenya, was found hanged at his villa in Spain, with his wife and 18-year-old daughter also found murdered in the house. And Pavel Pshelnikov, director of communications at Digital Logistics LLC, a subsidiary of Russian Railways, supposedly shot himself at his home in Moscow. The deaths have become so numerous that one media source has given the wave a nickname, Sudden Russian Death Syndrome. But by and far, the most conspicuous means of death has been the archaic mid-18th century habit of defenestration, that is, falling out of a high window. Ravil Maganov, vice president of Lukoil, fell out of one at the Central Clinical Hospital of the Presidential Administration in Moscow, and in February 2023, Marina Yankina, head of the financial department of the Defense Ministry, was found dead after supposedly falling from a 16th floor of her apartment. Even when a suspect is in government custody, their lives aren't safe. Most recently, Igor Shikurko, Deputy General Director of firm Yakuchkenerga, was discovered dead of unknown causes in his cell in a detention center in Yakutsk, Siberia on April 5, 2023. The extremely high number of potentially murdered rivals paints Russia in a bad light, an unstable dictatorship afraid of its own best and brightest while making enemies of its own nascent leadership. Couple that with Putin's rumored ill health, and it's just one more reason why President Xi may want to wait a year or two before cementing any permanent relationships with whoever's in charge in Russia post-Ukraine. What will Russia and Ukraine do? China and Russia are in an unenviable position. Both countries are seeing an inevitable shrinking of their populations, with China admitting an overcounting of its population during the last census by as much as 100 million. The Pew Research Center forecasts a decline from 1.4 billion people this year to 1.3 billion by 2050 and a staggering reduction to below 800 million by 2100. That's according to the UN's medium variant, or middle-of-the-road projection. Russia's upside-down population pyramid is no better. They're already experiencing a massive brain drain as a repercussion from its Ukraine fiasco, which was followed by as many as 400,000 young men who left to avoid the first conscription call-up in September 2022. Combine that with an aging population, a lower birth rate, and a decrease in life expectancy of 15 years since early 2022, and Russia's population is in free fall. Both these troubled countries might believe then that their only window to have enough young males to support a war is rapidly shrinking. That leaves Putin and Xi with a difficult, if not impossible, decision: launch a war now that they're not ready for and probably can't win, or wait a few years when their populations and economies are even less capable of enduring such hardships. It's an unenviable decision for any leader to make. China's Xi Jinping has made it clear Taiwan will be reunified with the mainland, even if it means it must happen at gunpoint. Meanwhile, America's President Joe Biden has vowed that America will defend Taiwan from invasion. The die has been cast for a showdown in the Pacific, and in what might be the fastest, most brutal, and most technologically advanced war to date, it's both nations' navies who will be doing the bulk of the fighting. So, who's really better, the Chinese or American Navy? China's naval expansion has been explosive and as miraculous as its economic expansion in the late 20th and early 21st century. Reeling from its humiliation during the Third Taiwan Strait crisis in the 90s, when the U.S. sailed a carrier strike group through the Taiwan Strait in response to Chinese missiles launched over Taiwan, China was determined to push the U.S. Navy off its shores for good. In 2012, Chinese President Hu Jintao called for China to become a maritime power so it could safeguard its own interests. Just 11 years later, China has overtaken the U.S. as the world's largest navy, and a significant number of its ships are better equipped than America's. In 1996, the Chinese Navy had only 57 destroyers and frigates, and only 3 of those ships carried air defense missiles, leaving them completely vulnerable to anti-ship missile attack. Of its 80 attack submarines, 3/4 of them were Soviet Rome-class, which entered service in 1950. But by 2015, China had already surpassed the U.S. Navy in size, with the DoD placing the Chinese Navy at 355 ships and submarines in 2021. That same year, the U.S. Navy had only 296 ships. When it comes to shipbuilding, China is leaving the U.S. in the dust. Between 2017 and 2019, China put more ships in the sea than India, Japan, Australia, France, and the UK combined. In 2021, Vice Admiral Kai-Achim Schonbach stated that the Chinese Navy was adding the equivalent of the entire French Navy to its inventory every 4 years. That same year, the U.S. Navy commissioned 7 vessels. China, meanwhile, commissioned 28. By 2030, it's estimated that China could have as many as 425 combat vessels. By comparison, the U.S. Navy is predicted to have only 309 combat vessels active. However, this is assuming that the People's Liberation Army Navy continues to have its budget expanded indefinitely, something that is extremely unlikely. After years of increasing defense spending, China is finally applying the brakes, and a number of brewing economic troubles for China could end up taking a significant bite out of the plan's shipbuilding budget. However, the U.S. should not expect budget woes to significantly decrease the size of the Chinese Navy, as the plan is China's top funding priority at the moment as it seeks to hurl the U.S. out of the Pacific. Numbers aren't everything either. While China has many more ships than the U.S. Navy, the American Navy is still greater by both tonnage and battle force missiles, or a count of how many missiles each fleet can bring to the fight. In 2019, the U.S. had more than double the number of battle force missiles versus China, and 4 years later that figure was shrunk, but the U.S. still retains a significant advantage, and by 2030 it's expected America will still have at least 25% of an advantage in battle force missiles. This is largely due to the disparity in the composition of each nation's fleets. China has a significant number of small vessels such as frigates and corvettes, with 43 frigates and 72 corvettes. While these ships can carry deadly anti-ship missiles, they do so in far fewer numbers than larger ships such as destroyers and cruisers. They also lack advanced radars and other equipment that their bigger cousins have, in exchange for the ability to operate quickly along coastal areas, a requirement that China has great need for. However, the U.S. Navy has a greater requirement for projecting large amounts of firepower far from its own shores, meaning a focus on larger destroyers and missile cruisers. The U.S., for instance, has nearly twice the number of destroyers as China, with 92 versus China's 50. Where it really matters, though, and where the U.S. is set to keep the advantage even to 2030 and beyond, is in aircraft carriers. Currently, the U.S. operates 11 aircraft carriers and 9 smaller amphibious assault carriers versus China's 2 operational aircraft carriers and 3 light carriers. America's carriers can put more aircraft into the sky than most nations' entire air forces, and this matters a great deal as the aircraft remains the dominant naval weapon in service today. America's carriers are also bigger and more capable, with far more mature air platforms such as the F-18 and F-35 versus China. And yet, China's shipbuilding spree means that it has the advantage of fielding more advanced ships than the U.S., making use of new radars and sensors that U.S. ships must either wait for, refit for, or will never get until they're completely replaced by a brand new ship. There's a big advantage to building a navy from scratch, while the U.S. has to make do with the same ships it's had for as much as 40 years. This could lead to a significant upset in the brawl in the Pacific, but how does each nation's ships stack up against the other? When it comes to aircraft carriers, China is not only dwarfed in size but also in capabilities. Its Type 001 and 002 carriers, the Liaoning and Shandong, are all former Soviet Kuznetsov-class carriers, with the Liaoning originally purchased from Russia so that China could begin training on carrier operations. China does have a modern carrier in development right now, the Type 003, but that ship won't be operational for years yet. Each of these carriers is equipped with 44 total aircraft, including 32 J-15 Flying Sharks, 8 Shanghe transport helicopters, and 4 Harbin anti-submarine warfare helicopters. The ship is also equipped with 3 Sea-Whiz stations and 3 short-range air defense missile cells, each holding 18 missiles. This allows the carrier to put up a last-ditch defense against incoming anti-ship missiles, though its primary protection is its escort fleet and aircraft. But China's current carriers have a few problems. The J-15 is China's first attempt at building a carrier fighter, and this off-brand Sukhoi fighter has a host of problems. Originally reverse-engineered from a Su-33 prototype purchased from Ukraine in 2001, China has yet to address key problems in the fighter's design. Its engines are very underpowered, which limits how much ordnance a J-15 could bring to the fight, a limitation that exists on top of that imposed by the Type 001 and Type 002 ski ramp design. design, which forces fighters to sacrifice either ordnance or fuel. China has historically always had troubles designing modern jet engines, and these troubles persist to this day. During testing, China lost 4 J-15s to crashes believed to be caused by mechanical troubles in the aircraft's engines. Adding to the J-15's troubles is the fact that it is one of the heaviest carrier fighters in the world, weighing in at a whopping 60,000 pounds. This is in comparison to the US's F-18 Super Hornet, coming in at a svelte 32,000 pounds and enjoying the benefit of much more powerful engines. Without going on a diet or developing far more powerful engines, China's small fleet of J-15s is best left on shore-based airfields rather than going to sea in what will inevitably be a losing war against US carrier fighters. China, however, is not resting on its laurels and is looking to develop a true 5th-generation carrier-based plane, a dicey proposition for a nation that's yet to master a conventional carrier fighter. The U.S. Navy currently operates 11 aircraft carriers, with 4 more carriers on order to 2032. America's current carrier fleet is composed of 10 Nimitz-class carriers, with the newest addition being the USS Gerald R. Ford, lead ship to the new Ford-class carriers. Unlike China's carrier fleet, every one of America's carriers are super carriers, with over double the aircraft. Nuclear carriers. America's fleet has the advantage of nuclear propulsion, which allows its ships to stay out at sea indefinitely. It also makes American carriers faster than conventional carriers, with a top speed that's classified but in excess of 30 knots. It's well known that at full power, a big U.S. supercarrier can outrun even its own escorts. This is a significant capability, given that a U.S. carrier's biggest enemy is China's vast inventory of anti-ship ballistic missiles fired from mainland China, greatly increasing the search radius of an incoming ballistic missile on a terminal descent. Like Chinese carriers, America's supercarriers are equipped with short-range air defenses to knock incoming missiles out of the sky, but also boast torpedo countermeasures. Its surface ship torpedo defense system was designed to directly attack incoming torpedoes, specifically those designed to home in on a ship's wake and thus immune to decoys. However, reliability issues have forced the removal of the system from 5 carriers that it was already installed on. While the system worked, its various components were unreliable, and now the Navy's looking to build on lessons learned to field a new active protection anti-torpedo system. Its most potent weapon, though, is its air wing. While acting as a mobile transport, each supercarrier can accommodate up to 130 F-18 Hornets. But in battle configuration, carriers typically carry 64 combat aircraft. Typically, this consists of 34 to 48 F-18s and 4 to 6 EA-18G Growlers for electronic warfare. However, increasingly, the Navy is adopting the F-35C, or carrier variant, of America's most numerous stealth fighter. The F-35 is nothing short of a game-changer, and China's naval air forces have nothing to match. However, just because the U.S. can bring more and more modern aircraft to the fight doesn't mean the U.S. has all the advantages. For one, China's AWACS platforms feature more powerful and more modern radars than the U.S.'s, which has lagged behind in acquiring more modern replacements for its aging AWACS air fleet. Once again, China has the advantage of building from scratch. But China also has the advantage in air-to-air missiles. Its J-15s might be hard-pressed to take off with an adequate combat loadout to truly challenge a U.S. naval air fleet, but the few that China can bring to the fight are all equipped with better missiles than anything the U.S. has to offer. The PL-15 has not only a greater range than America's AIM-120, estimates vary but are commonly accepted to be about a dozen miles, it's also faster than Western air-to-air missiles, even Britain's formidable Meteor. This allows Chinese aircraft to fire first against 4th-generation American aircraft from further away, making a fight between conventional U.S. and Chinese aircraft a dicey proposition for American aviators. The U.S. is striking back, though. Outpaced by China during its focus on the War on Terror, the U.S. now has no less than 6 new air-to-air missiles in development. Some of these are focused on replacing U.S. short-range Sidewinder missiles, but the most likely candidate to replace America's long-range striking power is the AIM-260, which features a classified range believed to be in excess of 25% greater than China's PL-15. The AIM-260 is expected to enter procurement within the next year or so, eliminating the only advantage China currently enjoys in the sky over the U.S. American aircraft, however, pose another significant threat to the Chinese Navy, and that comes in the form of a new generation of anti-ship missiles. China leapfrogged the U.S. with the development of the YJ-12 missile, an air-launched cruise missile that can be fitted with a warhead ranging from 450 to 1,100 pounds. The heavier warheads can be launched from China's fleet of bombers as well as its destroyers, while the lighter warhead can be used on China's fighter aircraft. alone, the missile has a range of approximately 250 miles, and when launched from a fighter, that can mean China could strike as far away as nearly 1,000 miles. Moving at Mach 4 with sea-skimming capabilities, the YJ-12 only gives American defenses approximately 45 seconds to respond to an incoming attack, making the U.S. ships very vulnerable to saturation attacks that overwhelm their air defenses. The U.S. is striking back in two ways. First, it's slowly replacing its stockpile of Cold War Harpoon anti-ship missiles. These venerable weapons have a 488-pound warhead and a range of only about 75 nautical miles. Though latest block developments have increased that range to 120 nautical miles, further they travel at subsonic speeds, making the Harpoon a significant downgrade from the YJ-12. The U.S. has responded to the YJ-12, as it so often does, with technological overkill. The Harpoon's replacement is the Long-Range Anti-Ship Missile, or LRASM, and is a generational leap ahead of the YJ-12. Its maximum range is classified, but believed to be around 230 nautical miles, with a 1,000-pound warhead. Unlike the YJ-12, the LRASM is subsonic, but that's not a flaw. It's a design feature, because the LRASM is not a normal anti-ship missile, it's a stealth anti-ship missile. Featuring some of the same materials used in U.S. stealth airframes, the LRASM travels at subsonic speeds in order to control its thermal signature and relies on its stealth capabilities to significantly shorten engagement time for enemy air defenses. The missile's advanced AI also allows it to be fired into a midst of enemy ships, with the missile's sensors comparing each potential target with an onboard library to select the right ship to hit. It can even differentiate between military and civilian ships and prioritize high-value targets such as aircraft carriers or amphibious assault ships over picket ships placed ahead of an enemy fleet to draw in hostile fire and defend from missile attacks. Launched in swarms, the LRASM can also deconflict, ensuring that multiple missiles don't strike the same target if unnecessary to achieve a kill. For all its advantages, though, the U.S. military still has only a few hundred of these missiles, and will likely need many more to launch saturation attacks that guarantee kills on Chinese ships. If war were to break out today, the U.S. would be doing the bulk of its fighting at a decisive anti-ship disadvantage. The second way the U.S. is striking back against the YJ-12, though, is to simply stop them from being launched in the first place. The U.S. military calls it cooperative engagement capability, and it basically boils down to connecting shooters with observers across an entire battle space. First dreamt up in the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory in the early 1970s, it was originally called Battle Group Anti-Air Warfare Coordination, but advancements in technology would only make it possible to conduct the first realistic trials in 1990. By 1992, however, CEC became an official acquisitions program. CEC breaks down to simply allowing one observer to guide the weapon fired by another shooter to their target. It also allows U.S. Navy ships and planes to cooperatively engage targets that only one partner might be able to see, bringing the total lethality of a deployed air wing or surface action group to bear on a target normally only able to be engaged by one platform. In a combat situation, the U.S. Navy would utilize its F-35 or stealth drones to penetrate into enemy airspace. EA-18G Growlers would use their electronic attack capabilities to actively degrade enemy sensors, allowing the F-35s to get even closer to well-protected airspace. F-35s could then pass on weapons quality tracking data to loitering E-2D Hawkeye platforms, which would then relay that data to fourth-generation aircraft such as the F-18. This effectively allows non-stealthy aircraft to engage deep inside of denied airspace by using stealth platforms to guide their weapons to target. The Navy is actively working on further programs to enhance situational awareness deep inside of contested airspace. F-35s may be stealthy, but that stealth goes right out the window the moment one turns on its radar to look for targets. This is why the F-35 has excellent passive sensors, but those severely limit the range at which they can independently track and identify enemy targets. Disposable drones and other tools are in development to solve this problem, and it's not just aircraft that can be brought into the kill chain, but ground or sea-based platforms as well. This would effectively deny China the ability to fly anti-ship aircraft within launch range of U.S. ships, negating the air-launched anti-ship missile threat. Up next, we have the two sides opposing destroyer fleets. China's latest destroyer, the Type 055, is a significant improvement over America's own ships by virtue of being a more modern design. However, the Type 55 is characterized as a cruiser by the U.S. Navy, given its larger size and capability to carry flag officers on board. Thus, it's better compared to the U.S.'s Ticonderoga-class cruisers than its Arleigh Burke destroyers. The Type 55 displaces 11,000 tons versus a Ticonderoga's 9,600 tons, giving it a significant mass advantage, and mass matters when anti-ship missiles are taken into consideration. However, all that extra mass also comes in the form of greater capabilities. The Type 55 has a max speed of 30 knots, making it slightly slower than a Ticonderoga at 32.5 knots. Not surprising given the significant mass difference between the two hulls. The Chinese cruiser also has a smaller range than its U.S. equivalent, with a range of about 5,000 nautical miles versus a Ticonderoga's 6,000 nautical miles. This is of little concern though, since China currently faces a war in its immediate neighborhood, while the U.S. must always fight the tyranny of distance and send ships far from its friendly shores. The U.S. has traditionally had an advantage in radar technology, but China's new Type 346B radars offer comparable capabilities to U.S. radars. It's hard to make an accurate assessment of which ships will have better radar, though, given significant amounts of Chinese disinformation about its own radar capabilities. Often, the Chinese, as the Russians, will claim to have radars capable of spotting American stealth aircraft, and that's not a surprise. American stealth fighters are not optimized to defeat low-frequency radars used to detect and track planes at long range, but rather high-frequency radars used to provide accurate weapon lock. Only large platforms like the B-2 and B-21 Raider are designed to defeat both types of radar. China's Type 55 comes up short against America's Ticonderoga in missile count, with 112 missiles versus 122. However, the Type 55 packs the YJ-12 anti-ship missile, while a Ticonderoga still carries the Harpoon anti-ship missile, swinging the advantage back in China's favor. With the advantage of building from scratch, the Type 55 also enjoys significant signature reduction features, making it harder to detect via radar or infrared versus a Ticonderoga. While the Type 55 is not a true stealth ship such as the US's Zumwalt destroyer, every advantage matters in combat. As it stands, the Type 55 can engage a Ticonderoga from further away with deadlier missiles. Zumwalts, by the way, aren't even worth mentioning in this review, as it's unlikely they'd even see combat. With only 3 ships in the class, the current fleet is more of a test bed than a combat-capable force, and it, along with the littoral combat ship, is a lesson in poor procurement practices for the U.S. military. The U.S. does maintain the numbers advantage, though, with 17 Ticonderogas versus China's 9 Type 55s. However, China continues to build Type 55s, while America's shipyards struggle to keep up with Navy orders and the U.S.'s replacement for the Ticonderoga, the DDG-X program. In the meantime, aging Ticonderogas are being replaced by Flight 3 Arleigh Burke destroyers, and it's these destroyers who will be making up the bulk of the U.S. surface combat power against China's Navy. In this matchup, we have the Arleigh Burke versus China's Type 52D. Currently, America is in the midst of a Flight 3 modernization program for its Arleigh Burkes, featuring improved radar amongst other capabilities. The first of the U.S.'s Flight 3 Arleigh Burkes was completed in 2021, and work continues at a steady pace to modernize the rest of the fleet even as the U.S. looks to its DDG-X program to replace the entire class. Arleigh Burkes significantly outgunned their Type 52D opponents, weighing in at 9,500 tons in their Flight 3 configuration versus 7,500 tons. They also outmuscled the Type 52D with 96 total missile cells and 2 torpedo tubes versus the Type 52D's 64 missile cells. However, when accounting for short-range air defense missiles, the Type 52D packs an additional 24 missiles in the HQ-10 short-range air defense variety, closing the gap with an Arleigh Burke. For its part, the Arleigh Burke can quad-pack its RIM-162 evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, which provides defense at medium ranges from incoming missiles and aircraft. Earlier Arleigh Burke models carry no helicopter, but Flights 2 and 3 models now carry 2 helicopters, which can be used for hunting down enemy submarines or conducting general reconnaissance, while the stretch variant of the Type 52D carrier carries 1 Harbin Z-20 helicopter. Pound for pound, the Arleigh Burke outmuscles the Type 52D opponent, as it's part of the reason the U.S. still has significantly more firepower than the Chinese Navy despite having fewer ships. Now, we move under the waves, with the U.S. fielding 68 submarines versus China's 78. However, once more, numbers are only part of the comparison, because there is little doubt that the U.S. has the decisive advantage in undersea warfare. Comparing the two navies' submarines can be difficult, given the extreme secrecy concerning some of the most powerful weapons to cruise the oceans. China has historically lagged far behind all the major powers in submarine warfare, and it wasn't until the mid-90s that the nation began to build what could be considered modern submarines. Originally, it purchased 12 Russian submarines to add to its fleet, and undoubtedly to reverse engineer, while adding 30 conventional submarines of the Sun and Yuan class, with a further 25 Yuan class boats to enter service by 2025. While all of America's submarines are nuclear-powered, only 12 of China's are: 2 Shang-1, 4 Shang-2, and 6 Jin-class subs, with the Jin-class being China's first sea-based nuclear deterrent and armed with nuclear ballistic missiles. Nuclear power doesn't necessarily mean that the U.S. fleet is better than China's, as nuke boats are notoriously noisy and difficult to silence, something that the U.S. has spent untold billions and decades of research into solving. Given that the U.S. Navy must fight far from home, conventional powered submarines are simply not an option, while China enjoys the benefit of fighting close to friendly ports. Thus, it has less of a need for long-endurance nuclear subs. However, as China looks past throwing the U.S. out of the Pacific and looks to becoming a global power, it is increasingly interested in further developing its nuclear submarines. U.S. submarines are more than capable of engaging surface ships, but America's subfleet is heavily focused on finding and eliminating rival submarines. China, meanwhile, has historically looked to its submarines to be part of a surface strike force, and only recently has it looked to change its submarine doctrine to be more in line with America's. This means that while their stealth is steadily improving, American Los Angeles and now Virginia-class submarines remain significantly ahead of their Chinese counterparts. However, China is well aware of this, and while it tries to close the technological gap under the waves, it seems more likely that China will focus on numbers rather than quality. In what's been called an undersea flood, China may simply opt to flood regional waters with a large number of submarines, seriously complicating the U.S. submarine fleet's efforts to destroy the Chinese surface fleet. The greatest threat to the U.S. subfleet, though, is that in order to simply maintain the current fleet while retiring aging vessels, America must build 2 new submarines every year. Yet the U.S. is far behind this quota and is struggling to complete 1 new submarine a year. Estimates by the U.S. Navy state it'll take at least until 2028 for U.S. shipbuilders to produce 2 Virginia-class boats a year, while China is actively expanding its own submarine production capabilities. Like in so many areas, China is simply outproducing the U.S., and even if some of its components are less advanced than the U.S.'s, numbers matter a great deal, especially when the U.S. must face China on unequal terms, because while China's concerns are regional, the U.S. Navy has global security commitments that it simply can't abandon even in case of a full-scale war against China. And this is America's greatest weakness as its Navy faces off against China's. Starting during the Obama presidency, the U.S. Pacific Fleet became the largest of its numerous fleets, but because of global security requirements, in any war the U.S. can still only bring to bear a portion of its Navy against China, while China can throw the entire plan against the Pacific Fleet. To counter this numbers disparity, the U.S. Navy is looking to seriously augment its fleet with unmanned drone ships and submarines, but this program has run into various difficulties, including a lack of vision on what exactly these unmanned vessels should be. Should the U.S. be building unmanned arsenal ships whose sole duty is to follow fleets around and fire vast numbers of missiles, or should it acquire stealthy surface ships which can zip deeply into enemy waters and launch attacks against Chinese ships? A lack of direction is the U.S. Navy's biggest problem. While China's procurement efforts are laser-focused, the U.S. Navy has for 2 decades been adrift in its aims and goals. This has led to numerous disastrous acquisitions which have burned up significant capital and time, both things the U.S. Navy could not afford to lose. The littoral combat ship is one example, a disaster of a ship that is combat insurvivable and haunted by frequent breakdowns. And yet, the U.S. continues to acquire them at a cost of $650 million apiece because Congress refuses to cancel the program, despite the U.S. Navy retiring LCS hulls within years of acquisition. Navy officials have practically begged Congress to stop buying the ship, yet precious shipyard space and acquisition funds continue to be wasted because the LCS program provides jobs in key congressional districts. The Zumwalt-class destroyer is another famous disaster. Pricing in at $4.4 billion, it was the costliest destroyer ever built by the U.S. Navy, and it is all but unusable in combat. When initially designed, the Zumwalt promised to be a cutting-edge next-generation ship that featured a very stealthy design with an advanced gun system which could fire conventional munitions with high precision hundreds of miles. Instead, as the Zumwalt's fancy new gun never truly materialized, the Navy was forced to cancel the entire Zumwalt program, skyrocketing the cost of its main gun's ammunition to $1 million a shot, promptly leading to its cancellation as well. All in all, the Zumwalt program is estimated to have cost the U.S. Navy $22 billion, and today the 3 surviving ships have no real combat role. With time and tens of billions of dollars wasted, the Navy has fallen behind its Chinese rival, but it does still retain key advantages which could prove decisive. First of all, the U.S. Navy is a combat-tested force. While it has seen no major surface action since 1944, it's involved in numerous combat engagements since then. The Chinese Navy's entire experience to date, meanwhile, consists of largely bullying other nations' fishing vessels off their own territorial waters. The U.S. also participates in routine large-scale exercises such as RIMPAC, which includes the ships of numerous other allied and partner nations. A culture of realistic training exercises that integrates combined arms operations gives the U.S. a training edge that China will struggle to match, given that its own training has historically been severely limited and overwhelmingly choreographed. It's only in recent years that China's begun to undergo realistic training, and only in the late 2010s did China integrate its military services under a joint command structure. America's second advantage is the one weapon it has that China cannot hope to match, and it's not a missile or a new airplane, rather its U.S. allies. There is some debate as to which Pacific allies would join the U.S. in a fight against China, but the U.S. has various treaties and partnerships with numerous Pacific countries. Those countries, in turn, have their own partnerships or alliances with major powers, such as the UK. Given that U.S. ships and aircraft are based on nations such as Japan, Australia, the Philippines, and South Korea, China faces the prospect of either being attacked by American assets from all fronts or attacking these facilities directly in order to deny their use to America. This will undoubtedly, however, pull those host nations into the conflict, magnifying China's problems. Japan and Australia are almost certain to immediately join the fight against China, given that China represents a significant threat to both nations' own maritime security. Japan is an import nation, which relies on sea trade to import various amounts of materials and food that it needs to operate its economy and keep its people fed. Yet most of Japan's trade routes run right past Taiwan, giving China the ability to sever Japan's trade if it were to take the island back by force. This is unacceptable to Japan, and even now Japan has rewritten its pacifist constitution to allow it to acquire more offensive weapons with which to threaten Chinese ships, ports, and even inland air bases. America's global network of allies gives the U.S. the ultimate high ground, even if it is currently outmatched in terms of number and even individual weapon systems. But the U.S. has one final trump card to play against the Chinese Navy, a naval blockade that China is helpless to stop. From the Gulf of Oman or the Malacca Straits, U.S. ships can impose a naval blockade of China's oil imports. With 60% of its global trade coming in via sea and the overwhelming majority of its oil supply, this puts China in the unenviable position of having its trade jugular severed by the U.S. Navy in two different geographical choke points. This is the reason that China is currently working toward acquiring numerous aircraft carriers, yet for now the nation remains unable to challenge a U.S. naval blockade. Even in the foreseeable future, if China were to match the U.S. in number of supercarriers, America still has the advantage of numerous friends and allies, which all ring these strategic choke points and could threaten any Chinese fleet with land-based or airborne anti-ship missile systems. A war between the U.S. and Chinese navies would be bloody and costly, but one side would emerge the clear victor, and in any scenario, time favors a U.S. victory. There's a new monster in the waters of the Pacific, and it's taken the U.S. Navy by surprise. Not projected to enter service for some time yet, the U.S. Navy was surprised by the speed with which China is finishing construction on its latest nuclear-powered submarine, the Type 096. Known as a lackluster submarine power, the Type 96 will strengthen the submarine portion of the Chinese nuclear triad and be the first true modern offering, and it's got the U.S. military planners seriously concerned. Historically, China has not been a great submarine power, with the tech behind these stealthy machines being jealously guarded by every major power. This is the one piece of technology the Chinese weren't able to either steal from the US or the Soviets, or reverse engineer from purchased Soviet hulls. Lacking the maturity and expertise of Western shipbuilders, China's efforts to create a capable submarine fleet have been subpar. In the 1980s, China began development on the Type 93 nuclear-powered attack submarine as a replacement to their first-generation Type 91. The second generation of nuclear sub is now the most modern of China's submarine fleet, albeit with significant upgrades. Known as the Type 93A Shang-2 class, it's complemented by the Jin-class Type 94A, which serves as China's nuclear deterrent, armed with 12 nuclear ballistic missiles. But these subs are built on old Soviet nuclear sub technology traded by the Russians in the early 1990s when they ran into significant cash troubles. Technical support and key design elements were provided by the Rubin Design Bureau for Marine Engineering, the Central Naval Agency of Russia. From this starting point, China built the Shang class, which featured modern improvements over the old Russian designs. In recent years, though, China's been building on lessons learned and incorporating new technologies to build a more competent and deadly submarine fleet. China is already deploying its newest conventional submarine, the Type 39C Yuan class, to Taiwan's territorial waters. This is an air-independent propulsion design which utilizes diesel engines to charge banks of electronic batteries and then cruises under battery power. Diesel submarines are both incredibly lethal and incredibly vulnerable. They operate by electric power drawn from massive banks of batteries, typically giving them an endurance of days. Because there's no engine or nuclear reactor with moving parts operating while submerged, diesel subs are notoriously difficult to locate while running on electric power. However, when that charge runs low, diesel subs are forced to surface and extend snorkels so they can run a diesel engine and recharge their batteries without asphyxiating their crews. This is when a diesel sub turns from predator to helpless prey, as the extended snorkels become a dead giveaway to a surface radar. New snorkels feature radar-absorbing materials, but high-resolution radars can still spot them at long ranges, and sensors known as diesel sniffers can lead a warship directly to the location of a charging diesel submarine. Not to mention that while near the surface, any airborne anti-submarine assets will easily spot the big submarine. Air-independent propulsion technology aims to dramatically increase the endurance of vulnerable diesel submarines by allowing them to make full use of their extreme stealth. AIP comes in 4 varieties. The first is closed-cycle diesel engines. These types of boats store a supply of oxygen, typically in liquid form, aboard the submarine. This oxygen is then pumped to the engines, which it uses for combustion. However, in order for the engines to run safely, the oxygen is mixed with an inert gas like argon that simulates real atmospheric oxygen. The exhaust gas is then chilled and scrubbed to extract leftover oxygen and argon before the rest of the waste gas is simply discharged into the seawater. Despite it being the cheapest of AIP options and in service since 1960, the technology is not in wide use today due to the need of stored liquid oxygen on board. The highly reactive gas is extremely prone to starting fires, as the Soviets found out during the Cold War. Closed-cycle steam turbines are a second AIP alternative that improves on the core concept of closed-cycle technology. Operated only by the French, this method combusts ethanol and oxygen under high pressure to generate steam, which is in turn used to run a turbine. A similar system to what we see in nuclear-powered submarines. The combustion occurs at such a high pressure that carbon dioxide can then be expelled directly into the sea at any depth without using a compressor. This AIP alternative has one huge advantage, a very high power output, which means a very fast submarine, outrunning even nuclear-powered boats. However, it's a very inefficient process, which means oxygen consumption is extremely high. The system that powers this technology is also said to be extremely complex, which is not something you want to hear if your sub breaks down hundreds of miles from shore. Due to the high cost, low efficiency, and extreme complexity, global navies opt for the next 2 technologies instead. Stirling cycle engines are a closed-cycle engine concept that has a working fluid, a substance such as the steam in nuclear-powered submarines which drives the shaft, permanently contained within the system itself. The working fluid is heated, which in turn moves the pistons and runs the submarine engine. A generator coupled to the engine provides electricity and recharges the onboard batteries. Typically, liquid oxygen is used as an oxidizer, and regular old diesel fuel is used to run the engine, with the exhaust scrubbed and released into the seawater. Compared with other AIP technologies, Stirling cycle engines are much cheaper and less complex, and run on regular old diesel, making them cheap to refuel. They're also much quieter than closed-cycle steam turbine engines, but a lot noisier than fuel cell diesel submarines. The submarine is also limited to a dive depth of 200 meters while the engine is engaged. Fuel cell AIP tech is the most popular and widely used today. Fuel cells convert chemical energy into electricity, typically by using a fuel and an oxidizer. Hydrogen, the fuel, is typically allowed to react with oxygen, with the chemical energy producing electricity, while water and heat are released as byproducts. Currently, Germany is the world leader in fuel cell technology and supplies most of the world's demand for AIP diesel submarines. However, France is working on a next-generation fuel cell diesel submarine, and India is looking to integrate the technology into its own subs. Fuel cells have almost no moving parts and thus allow for an incredible level of stealth. They can also achieve a fuel efficiency as high as 80%, giving their submarine great endurance. Hydrogen fuel cells also have the added bonus of creating no byproducts except for water and heat, making them environmentally friendly. The only major drawback to the technology is that they are very technologically complex and very expensive, limiting who can afford them. While details remain scarce, it's believed that China's Yuan class is using a Stirling engine, which has interesting implications as to how China plans to use this new attack submarine. America famously operates an all-nuclear submarine fleet. That's because America seeks to hold every potential enemy at arm's length. This is key to the U.S. success throughout the 20th and 21st century. The ultimate goal is and always has been to ensure the homeland remains completely untouched in time of war. Diesel submarines have greatly limited range due to their need to carry fuel stores, while nuclear submarines are limited only by how much food you can pack on for the crew. Air-independent propulsion technology can greatly increase a diesel sub's range while removing its vulnerability, as the sub no longer needs to snorkel, but it's still ultimately limited in range by the amount of fuel it can carry, and refueling your submarine halfway across the Pacific is going to be a dead giveaway to the enemy. Thus, the option to field a new diesel AIP submarine means that China's looking to address regional, not global concerns, namely Japanese, Australian, Taiwanese, and American forces in its own backyard in a potential struggle over Taiwan. Operating only a few hundred miles from friendly ports, AIP is an excellent choice for the Chinese Navy, coming in at a fraction of the price of a U.S. nuclear submarine while enjoying the benefits of extreme stealth. Nuclear submarines may have unlimited endurance, but they're also notoriously noisy, as the nuclear reactor is constantly operating and can never be shut down. This problem has forced the U.S. to spend billions on silencing technology, and today tracking a U.S. nuclear submarine has been described as it being easier to simply listen for silent spots in the ocean. Outside of crashed UFO technology and the true origin of Bigfoot, silencing technology for its nuclear fleet is one of the U.S.'s most closely guarded secrets. Cost matters in a war between the US and China, because China knows that it has a considerable disadvantage in the undersea realm. A decade ago, Chinese submarines were described by sonar operators as sounding like the contents of a kitchen drawer bouncing around the bed of a truck going 40 miles per hour down a dirt road. Today, it's made leaps and bounds in silencing its notoriously noisy boats, prompting some US admirals to comment on the improved capabilities observed by American patrols in the Pacific. But the US is the old dog in the undersea game, even if it let its ASW capabilities seriously atrophy after the Cold War, leading to some embarrassing kills during exercises against friendly diesel subs in the early 2000s. Thus, China expects to lose a significant number of subs in a fight against the US and its allies. And having a submarine that costs less than half of a US nuclear-powered attack submarine becomes an incredibly attractive option, even if you're being forced to sacrifice the capability to project power globally. It's incredibly difficult to determine just how much of a threat the Yuan class is, though, given the extreme secrecy that shrouds any nation's attack submarines. What we do know, we can infer from current developments, projected needs, and observations of the submarine itself. The sail, for example, has been redesigned from previous models, implying a greater need for surface or near-surface stealth. This could be because of very long transit times in and out of Chinese ports, or because the submarine will have a strong focus on the insertion of Special Forces troops. We also know that the aft casing has been extended to contain a towed sonar array, a typical feature of modern submarines that allows them to operate a sonar safely from a distance. Since enemy submarines are looking for the noise of your own sonar, towing it several hundred meters behind you is a safe way of using it actively while not getting yourself blown up. This capability has long been missing from Chinese submarines and makes the Yuan class a significantly more dangerous ASW opponent. The hull of the Yuan class also appears to be using a new type of anechoic coating, and it's missing the rubber tiles visible on earlier models on top of the hull. Rubber tiles are still used along the bottom of the boat though, and the new coating visible on the top does appear to be rubberized but slightly uneven. This could signify ongoing manufacturing troubles for China, which has lagged significantly behind the West in extreme precision manufacturing or advanced tooling machines, such as the 5- or 7-axis tool machines. Similar lack of high precision can be seen on the J-20 stealth fighter, which has noticeable gaps in panels which increase its radar signature. The Yuan class is likely primarily an anti-ship platform, which makes sense for a conflict in the South Pacific. This differs from the US, which primarily uses its attack subs to hunt for other submarines, only then turning their weapons on surface targets. Weapon stowage is believed to number at around 18 and could include the latest YJ-18B Supersonic anti-ship cruise missile, which would make the sub a significant threat to the US Navy surface vessels. However, whether it carries the YJ-18Bs or the older YJ-82 conventional anti-ship missiles, the Yuan will still need to link up with off-board assets to effectively target surface ships, rendering it vulnerable to kill chain disruption. On top of anti-ship missiles, the Yuan will carry standard dual-purpose anti-ship and anti-submarine torpedoes, but seems to also be equipped to conduct mining operations. This falls in line with the People's Liberation Army Navy's plan to create an anti-access area denial strategy that slows down US response in any war in the South Pacific. The Yuan class represents an evolving threat from China's underwater forces and a significant leap forward in submarine technology. By 2025, the DoD predicts that China's massive shipbuilding industry will have fielded 42 operational Yuans, which is bad news considering that this is exactly when many predict the US and China will be going to war. For the time being, it's widely believed that America's Virginia class remains the world's best attack submarine, but losses will be inevitable, and the fate of the Pacific might be decided by who can afford to replenish their naval assets the fastest. Here, China has both the cost and production advantage, which should send alarm bells ringing at the Pentagon. Freedom ain't free. It apparently costs exactly $816.7 billion in fiscal year 2023. This is the biggest U.S. defense budget to date. But how does the U.S. spend this massive budget, and how much of it goes to new weapon systems that are at least 50% UFO technology? This year's military budget has some special exemptions that don't appear on other budgets. It directly appropriates $12.6 billion to combat the effect of inflation in defense purchases. That means $12.6 billion is not going to buying anything new, just to cover the increased costs due to global inflation in the post-COVID-19 pandemic era. $3.8 billion is going toward covering added costs of inflation related to labor costs in military construction alone. That's not surprising, considering the United States military is one of the world's largest developers, building infrastructure around the world. However, something that puts into focus how much the U.S. military spends on fuel and why it's so interested in green energy is the whopping $2.5 billion set aside specifically to offset inflation's impact on fuel purchases. Imagine if you were paying an extra $2.5 billion on top of your normal gas bill. With recruitment shortfalls plaguing the world's militaries, the U.S. is investing in significant pay bonuses and special pay for service members in specific career fields. These bonuses extend to new personnel with skills the military is in need of, or personnel who train while in the military to gain certain proficiencies. If you're a new recruit with the right qualifications, you could net yourself as much as a $50,000 sign-on bonus, and if you're currently in active duty and train in specific skills the Army needs, such as persuasion, foreign languages, or technical explosives, you could net yourself a bonus totaling up to $40,000. Specific career fields the U.S. Army is looking for, which qualify for seasonal bonuses ranging from $3,000 to $15,000, include special forces with basic foreign language proficiency, psychological operations specialists, microwave systems operator-maintainer, human intelligence collector with a language proficiency, and air missile defense crew member. If you want a hot tip, learn an Arabic language or Chinese, and your recruiter will likely be offering you a significant bonus. How the budget is spent, though, starts first with the President's National Security Strategic Guidance. This is the vision the President of the United States of America sets for its military, what threats to prioritize or new areas to exploit. This in turn forms the National Defense Strategy, the fine strokes of which are classified, but the broad strokes includes the 4 priorities of 2023. The first and foremost priority is defending the homeland from the growing multi-domain threat posed by the People's Republic of China. That is a direct quote from the NDS. But what does it mean? China is identified as the foremost threat to the United States, its allies, and their shared interests. American national strategy is to contain and mitigate that threat at the economic, political, and military level. This includes countering China's growing capabilities as a multi-domain threat, a challenge the U.S. military hasn't had to face since the Cold War. Number 2 on the agenda is deterring an attack against the United States, all its allies, and partners. For the U.S., ensuring the current, mostly peaceful world order is a top priority because the best way to win a war is to never have to fight one in the first place. Global stability is good for everyone, and the reason you enjoy cheap electronics and other luxuries is a robust global trading system underpinned by the U.S. Navy. For the first time in history, trade goods can be shipped around the world without fear of interdiction or any form of bullying by a hostile power or pirates. But the U.S. is heavily invested in limiting actual conflict as well. In the middle of October of 2023, a U.S. Navy ship intercepted several long-range land attack missiles fired out of Yemen. It's unknown who the ultimate targets were, but it's likely it was Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, or even Israel. They were likely fired by Iran-backed militias and specifically meant to stir up regional conflict. The U.S.'s heavy military presence in the Middle East ensures the free flow of oil, and contrary to popular narratives, it's not even directly for U.S. benefit. America imports most of its oil from Canada, with about 11% of its oil imports coming out of the Middle East. The reason the US has a vested interest in the flow of oil out of the region is for global stability, as many other countries depend on it. Happy countries don't start wars, which keeps global trade flowing, which benefits the US and everyone else. The US also maintains a heavy presence in Southeast Asia and in Europe, where its forces are a major bulwark to regional aggressors like China or Russia. Third on the national defense strategy is deterring aggression while still being able to prevail in an active war. This means that the US defense budget needs to be robust enough to handle a shooting war while also ensuring US forces elsewhere remain credible deterrents against future hostilities. This one has been an increasingly tricky concept as America's rivals begin to catch up on its capabilities. In 2000, the US had an official policy of being able to fight and win two major wars simultaneously. Today, this is simply not feasible given the rapid modernization of the Chinese military, whom the US considers its primary threat. Lastly, the National Defense Strategy highlights the need to build a resilient joint force and defense ecosystem. This means prioritizing funding for robust training for all active duty members, with the US having the most aggressive training schedule of any of the major militaries. It also means, however, investing into the total defense ecosystem, from national defense contractors to war colleges, think tanks, etc. For the US military to remain the world's best, it needs an entire ecosystem that encourages innovation and education. Going into specifics, the National Defense Strategy highlights the People's Republic of China as the US's greatest strategic competitor and pacing challenge. China has significantly closed the gap between its military and the US's, and America is not happy with even a distant second-place competitor. New investments aim to kickstart a process of innovation and create yet another major offset or strategic shift that ensures uncontested dominance. Key areas of focus include advances in stealth technologies, nanomaterials and construction, and artificial intelligence. Out of its vast budget, the Department of Defense has highlighted other smaller but key objectives. First is an emphasis on integrated deterrence through investments in the nuclear triad, space and cyberspace, and missile defense. The US aims to make itself a very hard nuclear target and thus ensure its continued safety in a world where Iran could develop nukes if it really wanted to, and North Korea already has. Russia's nuclear saber-rattling might be all a bluff, but the DoD takes it very seriously, and the billions spent in deterrence will serve as a reminder that attacking the US ensures one's own extinction. Another major focus is on what the DoD refers to as campaigning. Under the Biden administration, a renewed focus has been put on strengthening partnerships and alliances after the uncertainty or even outward hostility toward partners during the previous administration. The US's greatest advantage is its network of allies and partners, the likes of which the world has never seen before. It's this vast network that acts as a major force multiplier for the US military, giving it a global reach and deterrence. But the Biden administration is looking to expand that network even further and thus help offset some of the costs of deterrence by bringing in even more allies or partners. So far, this has been very successful, especially in the South Pacific, where China is finding itself increasingly isolated. A major investment in innovation and reforming acquisition practices aims to fix the multi-year process it usually takes to bring new capabilities on board. The war in Ukraine has shown the need for rapid adaptability, and the US is aiming to streamline the procurement of new capabilities while encouraging innovation. Climate change has been identified by the DoD as a major threat to not just its readiness, but the global order. Significant funds are allocated toward renewables and hardening installations against the effects of climate change. Fuels such as biodiesel or all-electric combat vehicles will help make the US more resilient in combat. A $55 billion investment into military healthcare is aimed at improving the care that active duty and veterans both receive. To help with morale issues, the new budget is also allocating $9.2 billion for family support programs, including on-base recreation centers and all kinds of services from financial advisors to counseling. $500 million is going to implement some of the recommendations from the Independent Review Commission, which found sexual assault to be an ongoing problem in the U.S. military. In the wake of the contentious 2020 election and former President Trump's current campaign rhetoric and undermining of democratic and legal institutions, extremism within the ranks has also been found to be a significant concern, and part of the $500 million will go to combating it. Now let's get into some numbers. First up is nuclear modernization and deterrence. With an aging nuclear arsenal, the U.S. identified a priority need to modernize and update its nuclear capabilities. The Minuteman III ICBM was built in the 70s and continues to be the mainstay of American nuclear deterrence. Its replacement, the LGM-35A Sentinel, is well under development and receiving $3.6 billion in funding this year. The money will go toward the development of the missile itself, but also modernization and replacement of Minuteman III infrastructure, which is set to begin in the late 2020s. Next up is the Long-Range Standoff Cruise Missile, which is receiving $1 billion in funding. This air-launched cruise missile is replacing the AGM-86B air-launched cruise missile, which is the U.S. Air Force's primary tool for nuclear deterrence. With new and evolving anti-air threats, the LRSO will modernize the Air Force's ability to hold strategic targets at risk of nuclear attack, and thus strengthen deterrence. The biggest item on the list is the Columbia-class submarine, receiving $6.3 billion in funding. This is the replacement to the Navy's current boomers, the Ohio class. It'll be a sub which can take on both nuclear and conventional strike missions and modernize the undersea leg of the nuclear triad. Related is a life extension program for the Trident II submarine-launched ballistic missile. This is receiving $1.7 billion in funds and has the goal of extending the service life of America's current stockpile of submarine-launched nuclear missiles. The famous Trident II will be receiving new electronics and guidance packages, as well as a redesign to allow for more easy upgrades in the future. The program the DoD is least likely to talk about is the B-21 bomber, which is receiving a major boost in funding to $5 billion. The B-21 Raider will have both a nuclear and conventional mission and become the most important aircraft in the U.S. arsenal. With a goal of 100, this will be the biggest stealth bomber fleet in the world, a significant deterrent to both conventional and nuclear conflict. A low-rate initial production contract is expected to be issued by the Air Force by the end of this year. $20 million is going toward the mission of converting the F-35 to be nuclear capable. This will result in the F-35 replacing the F-16 in the nuclear deterrence mission, with the aircraft receiving nuclear certification in 2024. Up next is heavy investments into space and space-based systems. How heavy an investment? Good luck getting the DoD to give you any hard figures. Like many budget items, the DoD can obfuscate exact funding figures in some areas in order to deny any potential adversary an inside look at capabilities. What is known is that the U.S. sees space as an increasingly important part of national security, with key priorities in developing resilient space-based surveillance and communications. A new generation of thermal imaging satellites aims to modernize America's early warning system. An unspecified amount of funds will also go towards shooting down space aliens and plundering their UFO secrets. There are some major weapons programs that stand out on their own as huge investments for the United States. These are key systems that the U.S. views as absolutely integral to its continued dominance in the air, on land, or at sea. The F-35 is receiving $11 billion in funding for both acquisition and upgrading to the new Block 4 configuration, which is dramatically increasing the capabilities of what is already the most capable aircraft in the world. The F-15EX is receiving $2.8 billion of funding for the purchase of 24 new airframes. This might come as a surprising turn of events for some, given the Air Force's continued acquisition of the F-35. But the F-15EX features significant upgrades over the standard F-15 and fulfills one very important mission the F-35 currently can't, being a missile truck. With the ability to carry 12 missiles, the F-15EX will work side by side with the F-35 to shoot down targets that would normally threaten the 4.5-gen fighter. The NGAD, or the Next Generation Air Dominance Program, is receiving $1.7 billion in funding. This is undoubtedly not what the program is receiving, merely what the DoD is willing to publicly admit it is sinking into what'll be the world's first 6th-generation fighter. Reverse engineering crashed UFOs is hard though, so the program will not result in an operational fighter until the early 2030s. The KC-46A tanker is receiving $2.9 billion for the acquisition of 15 additional aircraft. These are badly needed for the Air Force, given the aging status of its tanker fleet, and are crucial for air operations around the world. While the U.S. fighter pilots may get all the glory, without their tanker buddies they wouldn't be able to fly more than a few hundred miles from home base. Show some love in the comments for these flying gas station attendants, because it is an insanely dangerous job, and in the case of war they are a priority target that can't even defend themselves. The CH-53K King Stallion helicopter program is receiving $2.3 billion for the purchase of 10 additional aircraft. The CH-53K is the world's most powerful heavy-lift helicopter and serves primarily to deliver supplies and equipment to troops undertaking amphibious assault operations. However, with the ability to fly higher than ever before, there is nowhere the CH-53K can't deliver everything from food and ammo to howitzers. $1.3 billion will go to purchasing the E-2D AHE, or Advanced Hawkeye, with the U.S. Navy adding 5 to its inventory in 2023. These aircraft are critical for naval airborne operations, providing early warning radar coverage and command and control for hundreds of miles in every direction. A big emphasis on drones is represented, with nearly $3 billion going to Triton, Stingray, and Reaper unmanned vehicles. The future is increasingly looking like a drone one, and these attritable combat systems have proven their worth in U.S. operations around the world. A notable drone mention is the $200 million being invested in development of an as-yet unnamed drone meant to provide direct overwatch and fire support for Special Operations Forces. This will likely be a heavily armed but stealthy drone with long loiter time and excellent surveillance capabilities, able to deliver pinpoint firepower within seconds to operators deep behind enemy lines. Moving to major naval purchases, the Virginia-class submarine, which is replacing the Los Angeles-class nuclear attack sub, is receiving $7.3 billion in funding for the acquisition of 2 additional boats, or at least that's the hope, because shipbuilding on the Virginia-class is woefully behind schedule at a time that the Chinese are pumping out ships at a breakneck speed. $5.6 billion is going toward 2 brand-new Arleigh Burke destroyers, even as its replacement is still undergoing development. Ongoing construction of the Ford-class aircraft carrier, the most advanced supercarrier on the planet, will cost the DoD $3.2 billion this year alone, though no carrier is expected to be procured. This is merely payment on the acquisition contract, as it takes 5 to 7 years, or sometimes as much as 12 years, to build a new carrier. The Constellation class of new frigates still in development will receive $1.3 billion with the expected acquisition of 1 ship of the class. However, the Constellation class is not expected to enter operational service until 2026, when hopefully, if God is indeed a merciful God, the U.S. Navy will stop destroying the American budget by buying more useless littoral combat ships. A new San Antonio-class amphibious transport ship will be purchased for $1.8 billion, alongside an America-class amphibious assault ship for $1.1 billion. This represents the U.S. commitment to the Pacific and preparation for combat operations against the People's Republic of China across the island chains of the South Pacific. 2 new fleet replenishment oilers will be procured at a cost of $1 billion, along with an additional towing, salvage, and rescue ship for $100 million. A $300 million investment into large, uncrewed surface vessels represents the Navy's focus on building a fleet of drone ships to supplement its manned capabilities. As the Chinese Navy explodes in size, the U.S. is looking to offset the numbers advantage with unmanned ships. However, the program is still in the development phase as the Navy tries to figure out what roles exactly unmanned ships are best suited for. In space, there are 3 major programs being funded, and all are critical to U.S. capabilities. $1.6 billion is being spent on the launching of 6 classified payloads as part of the National Security Space Launch Program. What is the military putting into space that's so valuable? Other than new generations of satellites, if we actually knew and told you, we'd have to kill you. And who would generate our ad revenue then? A new generation of GPS satellites is being put into orbit for the low price of $1.8 billion. This includes research and development, as well as manufacture and launch. With greatly improved anti-jamming capabilities, GPS-3 aims to keep the U.S. military in contact with their satellites in even heavily denied environments. The space-based missile warning system is receiving $4.7 billion in funding for further development. This network of satellites will replace aging early warning satellites and feature greatly improved capabilities to help the U.S. respond faster and better identify incoming threats, allowing for more effective response. With just over $6 billion in funding, the U.S. military is investing heavily into the development and acquisition of a wide variety of different missiles. Key among these are the Precision Strike Missile, a next-generation replacement for the U.S. Army's ATACMS, which recently debuted in Ukraine to rave reviews from the Russians. They were literally dying over it. The Army will receive 120 of the PSM for continued testing. The Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, or JASSM, if you're not a nerd, is receiving nearly $1 billion in acquisition funds alone, representing the procurement of 581 new missiles. The JASSM is a next-generation land attack missile which can be fired from well out of the range of enemy air defenses to hold even fiercely denied targets at risk. Its seaborne cousin, the LRASM, is costing $500 million for the acquisition of 88 more missiles, nearly double the number of missiles acquired in 2022, and representing the U.S. gearing up for a fight against China. To offset supplies given to Ukraine, the U.S. is spending $812 million in acquiring 4,718 new GMLRS. These are highly effective precision rockets being used by Ukraine from its HIMARS. While GPS jamming by Russia has decreased their effectiveness, new software updates have restored HIMARS to its job of permanently democratizing Russian soldiers and their equipment. A significant investment in Patriot missiles of $1.037 billion will lead to the procurement of an additional 252 missiles and their launch platforms. Some of these will go to offset supplies given to Ukraine, while others will go toward hardening U.S. facilities abroad from missile attack, especially in the South Pacific. And speaking of the Pacific, $6.1 billion is earmarked specifically for supporting U.S. Indo-PACOM operations. The biggest line items here are $1.8 billion for modernizing facilities and equipment, and $2.3 billion alone just for training exercises, experimentation, and innovation. A radical shift in culture seeks to outfight the Chinese in any potential conflict by encouraging a new generation of scientists, engineers, and soldiers to think well outside the box. $1.2 billion will go toward improving the infrastructure and resiliency of U.S. forces in the region, with a focus on hardening against air and missile attack, but also limiting the damage of global climate change. America's bases in Guam, for example, are under threat by rising sea levels, and coastal infrastructure improvements aim to reduce the threat. European Command will receive $4.2 billion in funding, an increase of $400 million from the previous year. The U.S. is also looking to station an additional 200 soldiers in Europe as part of its growing logistics chain for U.S. equipment being used in Ukraine. The increase in funding will reflect additional training and exercises with NATO allies and partners, as well as enhanced pre-positioning of military equipment in Europe in case Russia decides it's tired of existing. An initial $300 million is earmarked specifically for Ukraine assistance, which is widely regarded as the single best defense investment the U.S. has undertaken since the Cold War. With the threat of ISIS diminishing, U.S. Central Command received $5.5 billion less than last year, and total CENTCOM's budget went from $34.3 billion in 2022 to $27.3 billion in 2023. Is there finally harmony in the Middle East? Is Saudi Arabia finally paying for its own defense? Keep dreaming. The change in budget represents a shift to other areas of priority for the U.S. military. Unfortunately, the October 7th terror attacks on Israel by Hamas and other terrorists, and the resulting spread of violence, 2024's budget's probably going to go back up for U.S. CENTCOM. The current biggest budget items for CENTCOM currently are ongoing operations and force protection at $5.6 billion. This includes items such as special combat duty pay, pay for mobilized reservists, cost of actual military operations, communications, pre-deployment training, supplies, deployment of combat and support forces, and more body armor and personal protective equipment. In-theater support is earmarked at $16.9 billion. This is technically part of ongoing operations, but includes the additional costs such as supporting expeditionary forces and the millions of dollars in high explosives bringing freedom to the Middle East, one fire mission at a time. $1.93 billion is being spent on security cooperation with allied or partner governments and institutions in the area, with an emphasis on counter-terrorism operations. This money goes directly to promoting regional stability by working together to counter transnational threats such as criminal networks and terrorist groups. It also includes training between U.S. and host nation troops to improve interoperability of both and improve proficiency of partner nations. Surprisingly, $520 million goes toward border security for various nations, with the U.S. financing security capabilities meant to combat the flow of drugs, narcotics, and extremist organizations. With the threat of war on the horizon, the U.S. is investing heavily into readiness. $2.4 billion in funding is going to equipment refresh or replacing old and worn-out equipment from deployments. The Army is investing $29.4 billion into training and readiness programs, including home station training and the Pacific Deterrence Initiative and European Deterrence Initiative. $12.9 billion will go to training the U.S. Army's ground forces and $3.5 billion for its aviation wing. The Navy is getting the biggest training budget of all, with $47.4 billion in 2023. This is hardly surprising, as the U.S. is primarily a maritime nation, and the U.S. Navy is the most important naval force in the world. $10 billion is going straight into ship maintenance as the Navy works to reduce maintenance costs and backlog, a serious drain on readiness. $14.4 billion is going to its aviation, hardly a surprise given the Navy pilots will be at the front lines of a future war with China. The Marines are receiving $4 billion for its ground combat troop training and $5.5 billion for its aviation. With the growing importance of marine aviation, this is hardly a surprise. The Air Force has the second highest readiness budget at $38.5 billion. It's requesting $28 billion alone for expanding the number of flight hours its pilots undertake. $18.1 billion is going to replenishing its inventory of aircraft and various weapon systems. Any war with China will take place at sea and in the air, so it's unsurprising that the Air Force is dramatically ramping up training for its aviators. The U.S. Space Force, meanwhile, which we'll admit we nearly forgot about, is receiving $3 billion in readiness funds. This is significant, given the Space Force only has a few thousand members and nearly the same budget as the Marine Corps. But that's because space is expensive, and keeping American space-based assets is doubly so. Key priorities are ensuring the survival of U.S. assets in case of hostilities with either Russia or China, with growing concern toward Chinese anti-satellite capabilities. The Space Force is also enacting Space Flag, a large force exercise similar to America's Red Flag. It'll be a training exercise focused on gaining and maintaining space superiority, and one iteration of the exercise will include partners from Australia, Canada, and Great Britain. $16.5 billion is going to science and technology. This funding goes to a variety of promising avenues of research, some of which won't have payoffs for many years or even decades. However, it's from this budget that things like the internet, lithium-ion batteries, AI, GPS, and microelectronics all have their origin. This funding can be grants to various groups or research and development taking place in the dozens of laboratories that support the Department of Defense. This is where Umbrella got its research grants, and the next technological revolution could be brewing. The National Defense Education Program is aimed at providing funding for programs that provide STEM outreach as early as kindergarten. Its goal is to encourage American education in STEM fields and thus keep America competitive on the global stage. A big focus has been on funding programs for minorities, such as the Research and Education Program for historically black colleges and universities. The goal is to tap into potential that historically the U.S. military has been locked out of due to disparities in the opportunities available to minority populations. If you've got the next great way to explode someone, the U.S. military doesn't care what the color of your skin is. The DoD has identified specific areas it considers critical to U.S. capabilities in the near future and beyond. This includes seed funding for research, funding to adopt existing technology, and the development of technology specifically for the defense sector. Seed areas include biotechnology, quantum science, future generation wireless technology, and advanced materials. This type of research may not have a direct application for years, but the Department of Defense considers development in these areas critical not just to the military success of the nation, but its financial success as well. Areas where the DoD is working on adapting tech to the military includes AI autonomy, microelectronics, integrated network system of systems, space technology, renewable energy generation and storage, advanced computing and software, and human-machine interfaces. These are areas of technology where solid foundations have already been laid, or the technology already has civilian application. The matter is funding ways to incorporate them into a military purpose. Often, it's exactly this funding that allows a company to create a viable commercial product. Lastly are areas of research specific to the military, and this includes directed energy systems, hypersonics, and integrated sensing and cyber. The U.S. defense budget is huge, the largest in the world, and more money than a significant amount of nations have in their budget, period. However, these are the highlights of the 2023 budget, painting a clear picture that the United States Department of Defense expects a major military confrontation in the near future. Back in spring of 2023, a treasure trove of secret documents was released by a disgraced former National Guardsman who spilled the tea on many classified documents regarding the Ukraine conflict. But while the Ukraine conflict got all the limelight in the media, other highly classified documents unrelated to Ukraine were also released in the leak. Among these was a National Geospatial Agency report detailing that the U.S. now believes China has its first operational supersonic spy drone. But what exactly is it? And what does its deployment mean for the U.S. military and its allies? The media became fixated on reports that this was some brand new technology that the U.S. knew nothing about. That part is actually not true. The Chinese military unveiled the aircraft in Tiananmen Square the first time back in 2019 during a military parade that celebrated the 70th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. Analyzing pictures from this time shows a few interesting features that make it a scary piece of equipment for the Chinese to have. The unmanned drone, dubbed the WZ-8, is approximately 67 feet long, with a wingspan of just over 9 feet and stands at 10.5 feet tall. The basic construction of the craft is a swept-back variety, meaning the leading edges of its wings sweep back into the body of its monoplane design. These features are necessary because the craft is believed to operate at extreme speeds and altitudes. Estimates vary, but the general consensus is that the craft has a surface ceiling of between 100,000 and 140,000 feet and can fly at speeds of around 3,330 miles per hour. To put this into perspective, the speed needed to reach hypersonic levels is just 500 miles per hour more, and the operating ceiling this craft can reach is estimated to be higher than that of both the SR-71 Blackbird and the highest manned flight ever recorded. But of course, this comparison should be taken with a grain of salt since they were manned aircraft. Even still, achieving such speeds and altitudes with an unmanned craft is impressive. But how can the Chinese attain such operating parameters? The short answer to this question is its rocket engines. It's an open secret that the Chinese have problems developing jet engines that can perform well at high altitudes and speeds. Rather than working to establish a domestic defense industry that's capable of developing and producing these advanced jet engines, China has been relegated to copying the outdated homework of other major military powers. Most of its domestically produced military aircraft engines are copies of US or Russian models, leading to the People's Liberation Army Air Force lagging behind other air forces in terms of the capabilities of their airframes. As a result, the Chinese opted not to use a jet engine for its high-tech drone. Instead, rockets are used to propel the craft to its claimed speeds of 3,330 miles per hour. Using rockets have a few benefits and drawbacks. The first benefit is that it allows the craft to achieve incredible speeds in a short amount of time. Building a rocket engine is also much more straightforward than a jet engine, placing less stress on China's underdeveloped research sector. But it also comes with a few drawbacks, including the fact that once you start a rocket engine, you can't stop it. That means that once the WZ-8 is launched, a rocket motor will quickly burn out, limiting the craft's flight time. The rocket engines also make it incredibly hard to control. In fact, how the Chinese have engineered the craft to control itself in flight above the heights where standard flight controls become ineffective remains a mystery. Examining photographic evidence from the Chinese military parade shows that the craft does not appear to have thrust vectoring capabilities. However, there is an opening on the nose of the craft that serves an unknown purpose. Eggheads in the military theorize that this could be where the internal navigation suite for the drone is housed. Some think it could also have housed some of the cameras and spy equipment on board when used for missions. But the fact remains that little is known about how the craft is controlled or how it moves during flight. But we do have a pretty good idea of how China will use it. The clue lies with the mounting brackets on top of the craft and China's recent upgrades to its bomber fleet. The H-6 bomber is the premier long-range bomber in the Chinese Air Force. Although it's based on the now ancient Soviet Tu-16 bomber, China has been upgrading its airframes to make them suitable for 21st century combat. One of these upgrades has given the H-6 the ability to fire the latest and greatest Chinese anti-ship missiles. But more recent versions of the class, the November variant, has some interesting characteristics never before seen in other variants. The bomber has had its bomb bay completely removed and replaced with a semi-recessed area. Inside this area are a series of hardpoints that correspond quite well with the hardpoints on the WZ-8 drone. It's theorized that the upgraded H-6Ns will act as a launch platform for the drone. Once deployed, the drone would quickly reach its cruise speed with an estimated flight time of around 20 minutes. During that 20 minutes, the drone could cover 1,100 miles before landing at an airstrip on one of the Chinese-controlled island chains. But what is it capable of doing in those short 20 minutes? As of the making of this video, US analysts believe that the drone is not equipped with any offensive weaponry. However, China may still try to arm it with missiles in the future. However, given that China's research and development capabilities are criminally underdeveloped, this is unlikely. Though it does not have weapons, the WZ-8 is believed to have a ton of cameras and sensors on board. The drone is also believed to use synthetic aperture cameras to see through thick clouds and raging storms to get accurate data no matter the weather conditions. However, can it pose a threat to U.S. forces? The greatest fear about this drone is that China can use it as a third-party targeting platform for long-range missiles. Third-party targeting is a common modern-day military tactic where a firing unit, such as a plane or a ship, receives radar tracks from another firing unit, meaning a missile can be launched beyond the effective range of the receiver's sensors. However, passing on high-quality information is no easy task. Over the years, China has invested heavily in fixing the first part of this problem by building up a huge ballistic missile inventory. Today, China has the largest and most versatile ballistic missile arsenal in the world. This investment was made with the hope that the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force could use the missile stockpile to keep U.S. ships as far away from the South China Sea as possible. However, because the Chinese Navy is much weaker than the U.S. Navy, and with Chinese planes not guaranteed safety past the first island chain, China must overwhelmingly rely on shore-based radar installations to pass high-quality targeting data to Chinese units. Because of the limitations of shore-based radar, namely range and fidelity over long distances, the Chinese military has been searching for years for a solution to get accurate firing data to its firing units to ensure that it can not only fire a huge blanket of missiles, but they also hit their intended targets. The U.S. intelligence services believes that the purpose of the WZ-8 is to eventually feed enough real-time targeting data to Chinese units that it'll increase the effective range of its missile arsenal. However, China's capacity to do this now and even in the future is limited. The kind of data the drone can collect and how quickly it can transmit it has yet to be revealed publicly. After all, data that is not high enough quality or severely time-delayed is not useful when firing missiles. Given how fast the craft can move and the altitude it reaches, it's more likely that the drone is more of a situation awareness tool than a third-party targeting platform, as much as the Chinese would hope otherwise. Because of the vast expanses of the Pacific, there are numerous ways U.S. ships can move to attack Chinese outposts in the South China Sea. With China's limited ability to project power past the South China Sea, the WZ-8 is probably the Chinese military's best bet as an early warning system of where the U.S. Navy is coming from. Even though the data it provides would not be good enough to guide a missile, it would provide the Chinese situational awareness to at least concentrate their forces and where to expect an attack from without having to worry about securing every naval route into the area. But how could the U.S. Navy defend against the WZ-8? Unlike China, the U.S. has the most capable air defense network in the world. Because the South China Sea is a maritime domain, the primary air defense network in this space would be provided by the U.S. Navy's Aegis missile defense system. Aegis has been the U.S. Navy's primary air defense system for decades, and it has been continually upgraded as emerging threats come around. There are different baselines of Aegis among the cruisers and destroyers equipped with it, broken down into two broad categories depending on whether the ship is ballistic missile defense capable. But broadly speaking, few commentators are worried about the U.S.'s ability to track and shoot down this threat because of how powerful the Aegis system is. This is because the U.S. has the SM-3 and SM-6 missiles. The SM-3 missile is specifically designed to attack high-altitude, fast-moving threats. Though intended for ballistic missile interception, this could certainly take out a target like the WZ-8. Additionally, the U.S. could also use the SM-6 missile. Intended for advanced threats or targets of unknown capabilities, these missiles are the only known defense against hypersonic threats targeting the U.S. Navy. With the WZ-8 reaching near hypersonic speeds, this is likely the missile that the U.S. can use to shoot it down. So with all that being said, is the WZ-8 something for the U.S. to worry about? Probably not, and here's why. The domestic Chinese drone industry is the leading exporter of both armed and unarmed combat drones to militaries across the world. But while these drones have proven themselves on the battlefield in places like Iraq and Yemen, they are cheap pieces of equipment for militaries fighting enemies with limited to no anti-air capabilities on a budget. By comparison, the U.S. is the unequivocal leader in both drone and anti-air technology. Because U.S. drones are so much more advanced than Chinese ones, China has been trying hard to close the gap. While the WZ-8 is a step in the right direction for China, it will likely do little to change the overall strategic picture. After all, with a limited flight time, data of unknown but probably dubious quality, and relying on another aircraft to launch it, the WZ-8 certainly has its weaknesses. When coupled with the fact that the U.S. Navy dominates the maritime domain's anti-air space, the WZ-8 in its current state presents few strategic-level problems. However, if China continues to refine the drone to increase its stay time in the air, or new information comes out about the quality of its data, or that it can be utilized as a third-party targeting platform, the US military will need to ensure its forces are more adequately protected from this threat. Xi Jinping has become known for his aggressive international moves, even potentially breaching the US homeland with spy balloons. But his greatest efforts might be much closer to home, as China looks to expand further in its backyard. But why does China need to expand? Is it lack of space? Not likely, as even though it's home to 1.4 billion people, it's one of the 3 largest countries in the world. While China has a massive population, many areas of the country are not densely populated. Is it seeking a military advantage or rare resources? Or is it just simple national pride? The answer is complicated, and to find out the truth, we have to go back to the beginning. China's borders have shifted a lot over the years, mainly with the coming and going of empires and dynasties. Borders were much more fluid hundreds of years ago, but things have been more stable in the modern day, with a few exceptions. China's modern expansion began in the 1950s, shortly after Mao Zedong took over the country in 1949. The ruthless communist leader was backed by the Soviet Union, and in addition to unraveling much of China's past institutions, he wanted to take back its past losses too, starting with one massive region in China's southwest. Tibet isn't just a key region bordering Nepal and India, it's the highest region on Earth, with most of it containing the Himalayan mountains, including parts of Mount Everest, the highest point on Earth. During the 7th century and beyond, Tibet was an empire in its own right, but after it fell, the region frequently fell under Chinese rule. Tibet gained its independence again in 1913, but at the time the Chinese government didn't recognize the country as an independent territory. This continued until 1951, when the People's Republic of China marched in and annexed the country. Tibet maintained some autonomy until 1959, when a failed uprising by Tibetan independence activists was crushed and the government was dissolved, with the country's religious leader, the Dalai Lama, also being exiled. And China has not loosened its grip since. While the oppression of the native Tibetans has lessened slightly since its peak, the Buddhist religion is still suppressed in the region. For a long time in the 1980s and beyond, Free Tibet was a common rallying cry of protesters, but China showed no interest in giving concessions, and in fact required recognition of its control over Tibet from most of its diplomatic partners. With no country willing to anger the nuclear power and actually support Tibetan independence, the movement faded in the headlines, which gave China the foothold in the Himalayas it needed. It continues to rule it to this day, with the issue largely being seen as settled after decades of occupation. And it's not the only area where China has maintained an iron grip. Aksai Chin seems like a strange place to mention. The border region of China and India is largely barren, isolated, and mostly uninhabited due to it being a high-altitude desert. It's part of the Kashmir region, which is also disputed with Pakistan. But it's controlled by neither them nor India. Instead, China rules it and has for decades. The original border was determined by the Johnson Line, a border created by a survey executed by a British bureaucrat in 1865. But China was not as powerful back then, so it was never consulted, and the territory ended up going to India. It would be the start of many problems regarding the region. When India gained independence in 1947, the Johnson Line was used as the boundary, which put Aksai Chin within their territory. However, it wasn't long before China started making inroads. The People's Republic of China soon constructed a massive road connecting Tibet and the region of Shanxing well within the Johnson Line. This was a rare case where annexation didn't come with the firing of shots. China simply marched into the isolated region of another country's territory and started building, waiting for their intrusion to be discovered. And when it was, they were ready. India only found out about the isolated road in 1957, and tensions skyrocketed. Over the next few years, clashes turned into major conflict, culminating in the Sino-Indian War of 1962. This was a short one-month war that turned the constant skirmishes between the two countries into a full war, and ended in a Chinese victory, as China took the territory it wanted and then unilaterally declared a ceasefire. Aksai Chin was the major Chinese gain in the war, and while India still considers it illegally annexed, no one has any intention of starting a war over it, although border skirmishes do continue. But why is this swath of inhospitable land so critical to China? Well, if you ask the spokespeople of the People's Republic, they'll tell you quite the story. According to them, Aksai Chin is a key part of the ancient Chinese Empire, and controlling it is a critical point of Chinese pride. Of course, this is mostly nonsense. The stories they reference come from an era where borders were far less clearly defined, and their claim to the region isn't backed up by many modern sources. The actual reason is far more down to earth. Aksai Chin might be mostly barren desert, but it is a desert in a very key region. China has recently placed a focus on the Shanxing region, where the oppressive policies toward the Uyghur minority have been the subject of global condemnation. The Aksai Chin region has become a key point between the two regions, and it also serves as the perfect vantage point to observe their longtime enemy. It's not the only border region that China has plans on taking from India, and this high ground gives China a key intelligence in any border skirmish. So it's unlikely China will give up its iron grip on Aksai Chin anytime soon. But not every region taken over by China is taken at gunpoint. The story of Hong Kong is a tricky one. The peninsula of Hong Kong was ceded to Britain at the conclusion of the First Opium War in 1842 as a treaty port for the massive empire. The region was soon populated by refugees from the mainland during the unrest there, and that helped the British colony become a fast-growing economy. Massive investment soon followed, and Britain obtained a 99-year lease on the territory in 1898. While the island was occupied by Japan during the Second World War, the British took it back over after the war, and Hong Kong soon became a global hub of industry. But there was a ticking clock to all the progress. The end of the lease was fast approaching, and there was little chance of extension. Britain had never negotiated the lease with the Chinese Communist Party, and getting the island back was a point of pride, regardless of the divided feelings of the local population. Ultimately, a bargain was struck. Great Britain would transfer the island over in 1997, while China would guarantee a 50-year period of autonomy where Hong Kong would be allowed to maintain its own political and economic system. Despite this, 500,000 Hong Kong residents headed for the border to emigrate before the transfer, not trusting China to keep its promises. They were right to be worried. Shortly after the transfer, Hong Kong faced serious crises, including a collapse of the Hong Kong dollar, several virus outbreaks, and a general financial crisis. At first, China's promise of one country, two systems wasn't broken. Unfortunately for Hong Kong, this wouldn't last long. China started interfering with local elections, requiring pre-screening of candidates to ensure a pro-China candidate won. The crisis hit a tipping point in 2019 when an amendment that would allow extradition to the Chinese mainland was proposed, and massive protests ensued, followed by even more dramatic crackdowns and arrests. Soon it was illegal to insult the national anthem of China, and all the candidates had to be approved by a Beijing-backed election committee. And then came COVID, which gave China the perfect excuse to increase its iron grip on the region. Residents of China hear about Americans complaining about lockdowns during COVID and laugh. For the average American, lockdowns meant not being able to go to the pub and waiting in line for toilet paper. Chinese lockdowns were far more intense, being backed up by legal and military force as the country became increasingly determined to keep a lid on the virus. And what happened in China also happened in Hong Kong. The crackdowns intensified as the Hong Kong administrators enforced similar policies and used the lockdowns as an excuse to shut down protests and memorials, including a yearly memorial for those killed in the Tiananmen Square protests. And so, democracy in Hong Kong ended almost 30 years ahead of schedule, with opposition leaders being arrested regularly while the rest of the world stands by the wayside. After all, it's China's business and everyone agreed to that. But China's biggest encroachment might not be on the land. The CCP has had its sights set on the South China Sea. Although the region is considered neutral territory and is used by multiple countries including China, Taiwan, Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam, that might be changing soon as China moves to stake its claim over the entire region. After all, it's right there in the name, and China has been getting close to stating the South China Sea is entirely under its direct control, and they have the military force to back it up. China is by far the biggest military force in the region and the only one with a world-class naval fleet. That essentially means that borders mean what they say they mean, and most countries who have been confronted by Chinese aggression in the sea have quickly backed off. However, many countries have filed legal claims against China in international courts for operating in or encroaching on their territorial waters. China has usually lost these cases and promptly disregards the ruling, instead defaulting to the sacred rule of might makes right. But how do you conquer water anyway? Well, in China's case, you replace the water with something else. Few of China's activities in recent years have raised more alarms than their building of artificial islands in the South China Sea. Usually intended to be used as military bases, these large-scale land reclamation projects, nicknamed the Great Wall of Sand, have resulted in 7 artificial islands of at least 2,000 combined acres. One of them now has military barracks and a runway, while another is going to become a tourist destination according to CCP reports. What they both have in common is that they are intended to turn sandbanks into Chinese islands and the water surrounding them into Chinese waterways. And China's investment in these islands might just be a long-term gambit. Taking over the South China Sea has many advantages for China. It brings them closer to being a regional hegemon, essentially forcing countries like Vietnam to align with them in exchange for easier access to the water. It gives them access to massive fishing waters and undersea resources, and potentially to any resources found buried deep under the waves. But more importantly, it might also be a way to scare off the United States from developing a military presence in the area, while also stopping the US from forming alliances with countries like Vietnam. And that might be key in China's other potential conquests. China's done a good job at securing its past conquests. No one seriously challenged control over Tibet or Aksai Chin in decades. Hong Kong is legally accepted Chinese territory, and no country is willing to risk a war over sand barriers in the South China Sea. But Xi Jinping looks at his map eagerly and sees there's still areas that belong within China's borders. The only question is, when will it be time to make the move and potentially risk a large-scale war? And the first area in his sights belongs to an old rival. While Aksai Chin was ceded to the Chinese, the same can't be said for another main disputed region of the India-China border. Arunachal Pradesh borders Bhutan and Myanmar, but most of its border is within the Tibet Autonomous Region of China, and that 1,129-kilometer stretch is heavily contested. The region has a population of over 1 million people, and a large part of it is claimed by China. Even though China captured the territory during the Sino-Indian War, it retreated from the region during the ceasefire, but has never given up its claim. At the center of this conflict is one key town, Tawang, the administrative headquarters of the district. It's not a key political town, but it is the cultural heart of Arunachal Pradesh, the home to one of the most famous Buddhist monasteries in the world. It's a key spot for the faith, a faith that China has brutally repressed over the decades. By taking over the region, China would consolidate its hold over Tibet, strike a major political blow against India, and make it harder to challenge its claims to the region. It's also a high-lying region, and the state would be key to a larger-scale invasion of India. But it's not clear if China has any direct plans to take over that region right now. Arunachal Pradesh is a point of pride for China, both to strike a blow against India and for the symbolism of conquering the town where the Dalai Lama retreated to after fleeing China. The region is also rich in resources, including natural gas and iron. In recent years, border skirmishes with India have been common, but both sides have been fairly careful not to escalate into a full-scale war. After all, both countries are nuclear powers, and China has as much to lose as India from a full war. But by keeping the pressure on Arunachal Pradesh, China continues to keep India on the defensive. But it's not the big prize China has its eyes on. Taiwan is a small island nation off the coast of China, but as many of you know, that description doesn't tell the whole story. The nation claims to be the legitimate government of all of China, dating back to its nasty civil war that erupted during the communist takeover of China. The forces of Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese national leader, lost to the communists but retreated to the island of Taiwan and have not given up control of the island since. The wounds of that civil war have not been healed over 70 years since, with the two governments still being bitter enemies. And that conflict might be about to boil over. With the support of the United States, Taiwan has boomed into an economic powerhouse, but China still insists that the island is part of China and will be brought back under its heel one way or another. Most countries in the world do not officially recognize Taiwan as a country, and China's veto keeps it out of the United Nations. But that hasn't stopped Taiwan from developing a robust trade relation with just about every major power in the world. And it's quickly becoming a massive powerhouse in the electronics sector, and that makes it an even bigger prize for China. Semiconductors make the world go round, and Taiwan has built a massive advantage in the manufacturing of these tiny computer chips thanks to its company TSMC, which controls a majority of the world's semiconductor production. This means that Taiwan could cut China off in the event of a war, causing their military sector and power grid to struggle to stay operational. This means that if China takes over Taiwan, it would be able to sway the consensus of countries at its will, forcing them to back off or risk being cut off from the vital supply of semiconductors. And this leaves China with the catch-22. Taiwan is the ultimate prize for China, but no one's sure whether she is using this as a threat or if he eventually plans to invade the island nation. And right now, that strategic ambiguity might be what China is looking for. If everyone thinks the CCP is on the verge of invading Taiwan, they'll be very hesitant to make any bold moves, like recognizing Taiwan as an independent nation or even visiting the country. But is China really planning to invade? This likely depends on whether she believes the United States is likely to back down if China makes the first move. When Russia first invaded Ukraine, most people assumed the war would be over in a week or two, and many thought it might be the trigger for China to make a move in the New World Order. Then, NATO weapons flooded into Ukraine, Russia's army started to look like a paper tiger, and everything changed. Right now, China is keeping its cards close to its chest, but a larger issue remains. Does China actually need to expand? The answer is yes, but not for the reason you might think. China isn't short on space, and one case gives that away. There's one region that borders China and has close ties to the region, and yet is not the subject of any threats or border skirmishes. That would be Mongolia, the most barren country landlocked between China and Russia, the 18th largest nation in the world, but with a population of only 3.2 million. It's an enormous plot of real estate. So why isn't China interested? It's because of the location. Mongolia's biggest protection is the fact that it's sandwiched between two great powers rivaling the United States. China and Russia would no doubt like to claim some of the other's territory, but both are careful not to pick a fight with one of their few allies, so Mongolia essentially serves as a buffer zone between them, guaranteeing protection from both. This leaves the sparsely populated nation free to develop its own culture and become a far-flung tourist destination for adventurous types. So China needs to expand, but it might just be a game of psychological warfare. China's primary concern right now seems to be proving it can grow into a superpower to rival the US. Most analysts say it has a long way to go, and before it can do that, it needs to establish itself as the dominant power in the region. Many of China's rivals are fast-growing powers. Taiwan is an economic powerhouse that controls the world's supply of vital computer components. India is a nuclear power with a fast-growing economy and is about to become the most populous country in the world. And Vietnam is reforming its economy and improving relations with the West. Add to that South Korea and Japan and their tight relations with the US, and China looks around and sees a future where it's isolated in its own backyard. So it expands to remind people it still has power and is willing to use it. In recent years, China's made a lot of noise and rattled sabers, but it's kept its actual moves to a minimum. Unlike Russia, which moved into Ukraine and now finds itself in a quagmire, China's encroached on India's border without a full invasion, pressured other countries out of the South China Sea, and threatened Taiwan with military exercises. Is it the prelude to something bigger? No one in the region is sure, and that's exactly how Xi Jinping likes it. For more on China's potential long-game gambit, check out Russia and China versus NATO, or watch this video instead.